Before we begin, if stories like this one speak to your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Victor Hale didn't knock. He never knocked. He kicked the door open with the heel of his boot on a Tuesday morning in January, walked straight into the Whitlock kitchen like he owned the floor beneath his feet, because in his mind, he already did. Three little girls scrambled backward from the table. The youngest knocked over her tin cup. Nobody bent down to pick it up. "You're 2 weeks past due," Hale said, pulling a folded paper from inside his coat. He dropped it on the table without looking at Margaret. 3 days. Then my men move your furniture into the snow." He turned and walked back out the same way he came in. Didn't close the door behind him. Margaret stood there with flour on her hands and nothing left to say. The cold air poured in through the open doorway. Outside, Hale's horse stamped once in the frozen dirt, and then the sound of hooves faded until there was nothing left but wind. If that was you standing in that kitchen, flour on your hands, 3 children watching your face for signs of what comes next, a piece of paper on the table that means the end of everything, what would you do? What would any of us do? This is the story of what Margaret Whitlock did. And it's the story of a stranger who appeared at the worst possible moment, carrying nothing, asking for almost nothing, whose presence would unravel Victor Hale's empire piece by piece. Subscribe now. Stay until the end. Because the truth about who Elias Boone really was will change the way you think about kindness for a long time. The bread was smaller than Margaret remembered bread being allowed to be. She turned it over in her hands twice before setting it on the cutting board. It was maybe the size of 2 fists pressed together, dense and a little darker on one side from where the oven ran hot near the back left corner. She'd been meaning to fix that for 2 years. Thomas had said he'd get to it. Thomas had said a lot of things. She picked up the knife. Behind her, Clara, who was 11 and old enough to understand math and what it meant when math came out wrong, was watching from the doorway. Ruth, who was 8 and spent most of her time pretending not to understand things she understood perfectly well, was sitting at the table drawing shapes in the frost on the window with one finger. And little Nora, who had just turned 6 last October and still believed that problems had solutions. If you just thought hard enough, was standing beside Margaret's elbow without touching anything. "Is that all of it?" Clara asked. "That's all of it," Margaret said. Clara didn't say anything else. That was the thing about Clara. She asked the question. She heard the answer. She folded it away somewhere inside herself and moved on. Margaret had always admired that about her oldest daughter and simultaneously worried it would make Clara's life harder than it needed to be. She cut the loaf into 4 pieces. 4 uneven pieces because bread doesn't divide evenly when you need it to, and the world doesn't either, and Margaret had stopped pretending otherwise somewhere around the 2nd winter after Thomas died. The pieces went on the plates. The plates went on the table. She poured what was left of the morning's water into 4 cups, and they all sat down. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did in January, which was everything at once. It came from 3 directions somehow. It found every gap in the walls that Thomas had been meaning to fix and had not fixed before the blizzard took him, and it pushed through those gaps with a kind of relentless, impersonal cruelty that Margaret had learned not to take personally. The cold didn't hate her. It simply didn't care about her. She had decided that was almost better. They bowed their heads. She said a few words that weren't quite prayer and weren't quite nothing. Something she'd developed in the years since the church felt too full of people looking at her with that particular tilt to their faces, that practiced sorrowful expression that meant they pitied her and were relieved it hadn't happened to them. Then they ate, or they started to. The knock came when Nora had eaten exactly 2 bites, and Ruth had torn her piece into smaller pieces the way she did when she was trying to make something last longer through the power of small increments. And Clara had eaten half of hers in 3 steady bites, the way Clara did everything. Direct, practical, without ceremony. Margaret froze. Nobody knocked on the door of the Whitlock place after dark. It was past 8 o'clock. The temperature had dropped so far and so fast that afternoon that she'd nailed an extra blanket over the window above the wash basin. There was no reason for any person she knew to be out on a night like this unless something had gone badly wrong somewhere. She stood up. "Mama," Clara said, not a question, just a statement of presence. "I'm watching. I'm here." "Stay at the table," Margaret said. She crossed to the door and didn't open it right away. That was something Thomas had taught her early on, when they were first homesteading, and she still jumped at every unexpected sound. You don't open a door at night until you know what's on the other side. You listen first. She listened. She heard breathing, slow and labored, like someone who had been walking a very long time in very cold air and had not quite caught up to themselves yet. She opened the door. The man on her porch was not large. She registered that first, which surprised her because she had been bracing herself for large. He was maybe an inch or two taller than she was, which put him somewhere around 5'10", and he was wrapped in a coat that had been a good coat once, maybe 15 years ago, and hadn't been a good coat in at least 10. His hat was pulled low. His boots? She looked down because she always looked at boots. Thomas had taught her that too. You learn things about a person from their boots. His boots were worn through at one heel, and the leather along the left toe was split open in a line about 2 inches long. His face, what she could see of it, was weathered in the way that faces get when they've spent years in open country. Not old. Maybe late 30s, early 40s, hard to say with men who worked outside. His eyes were dark, and they were steady, and he was shaking so quietly it took her a moment to notice, the kind of shaking that happened when a body had been cold for so long it was past making a fuss about it. He didn't say anything immediately. He met her eyes and then looked past her for just a second, at the light and the warmth inside. The way a person looks at something they've almost stopped expecting to find. Then he said, "I'm not here to cause trouble." His voice was steady. That surprised her too. She'd expected ragged, desperate. What she got was quiet and careful. "I can see you're at supper," he said. "I'm sorry for the interruption. I don't have any money, but I can work. I'm good at fixing things. If you have anything needs fixing, I'll work for a crust of bread and a place by the fire for the night. I'll be gone before you wake up." Margaret looked at him. She looked at his boots again, the split toe, the worn heel. She thought about the 4 plates on the table, the 4 pieces of bread, the fact that 3 of those pieces belonged to 3 children who were already going to bed a little hungry because 4 pieces from 1 small loaf was not enough. And everyone at that table knew it, and nobody said so because they had all agreed, without ever discussing it, not to say so. She thought about Thomas, about the morning of the blizzard, when he'd gone out to check the eastern fence, and she'd watched him walk into the white and waited 3 days for him to come back, and he came back wrong. She thought about how she had been alone on this land since then, making every decision, carrying every load, fixing what she could fix and letting go of what she couldn't, and how Victor Hale had walked into her kitchen 9 months after Thomas was in the ground and said he had paperwork that suggested her husband had borrowed money. He hadn't borrowed, and how she had never been able to prove otherwise. She thought about all of this in about 4 seconds. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. The man hesitated. "Ma'am, I want to be clear. I'm not asking for charity. I'll earn whatever you give me. I'll start first thing." "It's 15 below out there," Margaret said. "Come in." He came in. He stopped just inside the door and removed his hat. He didn't move further than that until she gestured toward the table, and even then he walked carefully, the way a person walks when they're aware that they've been let into something they aren't certain they deserve. The girls looked at him. He looked at the girls. "Evening," he said to all 3 of them. Clara said evening, because Clara was Clara. Ruth said nothing and drew her pieces of bread very slightly closer to herself. Nora looked at him for a long moment with her head tilted to one side, and then she picked up her piece of bread. Her whole piece, the piece Margaret had cut for her, the piece that was already smaller than it should have been, and she held it out across the table toward the stranger. The room went completely quiet. Margaret's throat tightened. She watched the man's face as he registered what was happening. Something moved across his expression, something she couldn't name exactly. It wasn't gratitude, or it wasn't only gratitude, it was something underneath gratitude, something that looked almost like pain. He reached out and took the bread. Very gently. The way you take something that costs more than it looks. "Thank you," he said to Nora. His voice had changed slightly. Still quiet, but different. Nora nodded like this was simply the reasonable thing to have done. Margaret got up and cut her own piece in half. She put 1/2 on a plate and set it in front of the man without explaining herself. He looked at it and then looked up at her, and she looked back at him with an expression that meant she wasn't going to discuss it. He ate. She watched him eat without staring at him, which required looking at a point slightly to his left and letting her peripheral vision do the work. He ate slowly and deliberately, which was the eating of a man who was genuinely hungry but had decided to have some dignity about it. He didn't finish what was on the plate. He ate about 3/4 of it, and then he stopped and looked at the remainder and seemed to make a decision. "I'll leave that," he said, "in case someone wants it later." Nobody wanted it later, but she didn't say that. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Elias," he said. "Elias Boone. Where are you coming from?" "Clara," Margaret said. "It's all right," Elias said. He looked at Clara with an expression that suggested he found her directness reasonable rather than rude. "I've been moving around, working where there's work. There's not much work in January." "There's not much work here either," Clara said, "but Mama said you could stay. I'm grateful. Can you fix a roof?" Clara. "The east section leaks," Clara said to her mother, unperturbed. "I'm just asking." Elias looked at Margaret. "I can fix a roof," he said. "We'll see in the morning," Margaret said. She made up a space by the fire. She brought him a blanket that had a hole in the corner she hadn't gotten around to mending, and a pillow that was flatter than a pillow had any right to be, and she showed him where the water bucket was and told him to help himself. He thanked her for each thing separately. Not effusively, just specifically the way people thank you when they mean it and are aware that meaning it and showing it are two different skills that don't always arrive together. She got the girls to bed. Clara went without argument, which was how Clara always went to bed, as though sleep was simply a task to be completed. Ruth made the brief protest she made every night, and then stopped when Margaret raised one eyebrow. Nora fell asleep before Margaret finished pulling the blanket over her. Margaret sat at the table after the girls were down and listened to the fire and looked at the piece of paper Victor Hale had left that morning. She'd read it 4 times already. She knew what it said. She was going to read it a 5th time now, not because she expected to find something new in it, but because sometimes you needed to look at the thing directly in order to figure out how to fight it. 3 days. She had 3 days. She put the paper down and looked at the shape of the man sleeping by her fire. He hadn't moved. His breathing was slow and even. Whatever anxiety had lived in his body while he stood on her porch had released itself now that he was warm and horizontal. She didn't know him. She had no reason to trust him beyond the fact that he'd eaten 3/4 of a plate of food when he was clearly hungry enough to eat all of it, and that he'd taken Nora's bread with a gentleness that didn't look practiced. That wasn't nothing. But it wasn't much either. She went to bed. She lay there for a long time listening to the wind find its way through the gaps in the walls, and she thought about bread and debt and the particular cruelty of men like Victor Hale, who understood that the most effective kind of power was the kind you could exercise in January, when people had nowhere to go and no margin to fight back. She thought about what she would do when the 3 days were up. She didn't have an answer yet. Outside, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the snow that had been threatening all week finally started to fall, slow and indifferent, covering everything equally the way weather does. The broken fences and the mended ones, the wide estates and the failing homesteads, the powerful and the desperate, all of it going white under the same sky. And somewhere in the middle of that storm, by the dying fire in her kitchen, a man named Elias Boone lay perfectly still with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, thinking about something Margaret couldn't have imagined and wouldn't learn for a very long time. His hands, she would later remember, were folded across his chest. Very still. Very controlled. Not the hands of a drifter. She just didn't know that yet. By the time Margaret woke at 5 in the morning, the fire had been rebuilt, the water bucket was full, and from somewhere outside came the clean, rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood, steady and unhurried, like someone who had been at it for a while and intended to keep going. She stood at the window. In the gray pre-dawn, with snow still coming down in thin curtains, she could just make out the shape of Elias Boone at the woodpile. He wasn't swinging the axe desperately or proving something. He was just working, methodical, efficient. The splits came apart cleanly, and he stacked them without looking, the way you stack wood when your hands know the job without being told. She watched him for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she went to make what there was to make for breakfast. The morning unfolded the way mornings did on a working ranch, or what remained of a working ranch, which in the Whitlock case meant 2 horses, 11 cattle that had survived the winter so far, a pig who had outlived 2 of the other pigs through sheer stubbornness, and approximately 40 things that needed doing, and approximately enough energy and time to do 20 of them. Elias came inside when she called. He washed his hands without being told. He sat where she pointed. "You split about a cord," she said. "Maybe a cord and a half," he said. Not bragging, just accounting. "You didn't have to start before sunup." "I was awake," he said. Seemed wasteful to lie there. She poured coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup and closed his eyes briefly. She understood that. Cold hands and hot coffee was one of the more uncomplicated pleasures left in the world. "The east section of the roof," she said. "How bad is it, do you think?" He looked up at her. "I didn't go up yet. But from outside this morning, there's at least 3 places where the pitch has shifted. Probably more where the snow's been sitting heavy. I'll need to look at it from the inside too. I have some lumber in his barn, left over from when Thomas built the second stall. That might be enough," he considered. "Might need to be creative." "Are you creative?" Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, the cousin of one. "When I have to be," he said. Clara appeared in the doorway, already dressed, which meant she had been up for a while. She looked at Elias, then at her mother, in the calculating way she had of assessing situations before committing to them. "The fence on the north side of the pasture is down," she said. 3 of the cattle got out last week. Mama got 2 back. We don't know where the 3rd one went." "Clara," Margaret said. "He said he could fix things," Clara said. "I'm telling him what needs fixing." Elias looked at Clara with a steadiness that seemed to earn her a degree of respect. "What color is the one that got out?" Clara blinked, which for Clara was the equivalent of a double take. "Brown, mostly, white patch on the left side." "I'll look," he said. He did look. He spent 3 hours that morning working on the north fence, restringing wire so precisely that the posts held better than they had when Thomas first set them. And then he walked the ridge line north of the property where the cattle sometimes drifted when they were looking for shelter from the wind. And he came back at noon leading a mostly brown cow with a white patch on her left side. The rope looped loosely around her neck in a way that suggested the cow didn't mind being led. Ruth saw him from the window and ran to tell Clara. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him come down the slope, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Huh." That was, Margaret knew, high praise. Elias returned the cow to the pasture and fixed the gap in the fence she'd used to leave. And then he came to the barn and spent an hour reinforcing the side wall that had started to lean outward from the weight of 2 winters of snow accumulation. Margaret watched him work. She told herself she was watching to make sure he didn't damage anything. But that wasn't entirely true. The truth was that there was something in the way he worked. The economy of motion, the absence of wasted effort, the way he'd pause sometimes and look at a problem from 2 or 3 angles before he touched it, that she found genuinely difficult to look away from. She knew how men worked. She'd watched Thomas work for 11 years. Thomas had been good with his hands, practical and capable in the way that homesteading demanded. But this was different from what Thomas did. Thomas worked like a man who knew his land and knew his tools. Elias worked like a man who had seen a great many different problems in a great many different places and had developed a set of principles that applied across all of them. She didn't know how to explain the difference more precisely than that, but she felt it. At supper that second evening, Nora climbed up on the bench next to Elias without asking permission and sat there eating her beans with the quiet confidence of a child who had already decided something and saw no reason to revisit it. Elias didn't move away or stiffen. He just made a little more room on the bench, which was the correct response. And Nora accepted this as though she had expected nothing less. Ruth was watching from across the table. Ruth was always watching. "Where do you sleep?" Nora asked Elias. "By the fire," he said. "It's cold by the fire at night when the fire gets low," Nora said, with the authority of someone who had personal experience with this. "I've slept in colder places," he said. Nora considered this. "Like where?" "Nora," Margaret said. "Like in a lot of places," Elias said, in a tone that was not unkind but was also clearly the end of that particular line of questioning. Nora accepted this without taking offense, which suggested she had good instincts about which doors were worth pushing and which ones weren't. That night, after the girls were asleep and the fire was down to coals, Margaret sat at the table with the paper from Victor Hale in front of her again. She heard Elias shift on his bedroll and then go still. She should have gone to sleep. Instead, she said quietly, into the near dark of her kitchen, "He's going to take the ranch." She wasn't sure why she said it. Not to Elias specifically. Maybe to the room, Maybe to Thomas, who wasn't there. Maybe because she'd been holding it alone for so long that it had developed weight she could no longer carry in silence. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who is he?" "Victor Hale." She said the name flat, without inflection, the way you say the name of something you've thought about until thinking about it anymore hurts. "Land speculator. He's been buying up homesteads around the valley for 3 years. Or taking them. He has papers that say Thomas borrowed money from him. Thomas didn't borrow money from him, but the papers look real and I can't prove they're not, and the judge in this county—" She stopped. "The judge," Elias said, "is in Hale's pocket." "Yes." Silence. 3 days, Margaret said. "I heard you mention it," Elias said. She hadn't mentioned it to him, which meant he'd overheard. She was too tired to be bothered by that. "I don't know what to do," she said. This was something she almost never said. She was a woman who figured out what to do. She had been figuring out what to do for 3 years without anyone to consult, and she had been mostly adequate at it, and there was a pride in that adequacy that kept her from admitting its limits. But it was late, and it was cold, and she had 3 children asleep in the next room, and 3 days and 1 small loaf's worth of resources left against a man with unlimited ones. Elias was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he said, "Don't move." "I beg your pardon?" "Don't move anything. Don't pack anything. Don't make it look like you're getting ready to leave. He wants you to leave quietly. Don't give him that." She looked toward where he was lying in the dark. "Why?" "Because men like that depend on people being afraid enough to give up before the fight starts," Elias said. "The minute you start packing, you've decided it's over. Keep living like it's not over." "That's easy advice," she said. There was an edge in her voice she didn't try to hide. "I know it is," he said, not defensively, just acknowledging it. She looked at the fire for a while. "Go to sleep," she finally said. To both of them, really. He didn't respond. But in the morning when she came out, the coffee was made and the water was full, and from outside came the sound of something being repaired. A door hinge, she thought, the one on the barn that had been grinding wrong for 2 months. And that was something. She wasn't sure what. But it was something. The hinge on the barn door stopped grinding on the 3rd morning. Margaret noticed it when she went out before dawn to check on the cattle, the way she did every morning, regardless of weather, regardless of how little sleep she'd gotten, regardless of everything. The door swung open, smooth and quiet, and she stood there for a moment holding the handle and thinking about how long that grinding had been part of the morning, how she'd stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing things that have been wrong for too long. Thomas had said he'd fix it. Then Thomas was gone, and she'd said she'd fix it. Then 3 winters passed, and the grinding just became the sound the morning made. Now it didn't. She pulled the door shut and opened it again just to feel it. Smooth, clean. Whoever had done it had not just oiled the hinge, but reset the pin and reseated the plate on the door frame, which was the real problem, the thing under the obvious thing that most people wouldn't have bothered to find. She stood in the cold for a moment, barn door in her hand, breath coming out white. Then she went inside to start the fire. Elias was already awake. She was beginning to suspect he didn't sleep much, or that he slept in the light, careful way of someone whose years had trained him not to go fully under. He was sitting with his back against the wall near the dead coals, not doing anything, just sitting with his hands loose in his lap and his eyes open. And when she came in, he looked up without startling. "The hinge," she said. "Needed doing," he said. She didn't say thank you again. She'd already said it twice, and it was starting to feel like currency she didn't have enough of. Instead, she built the fire and put the coffee on, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was becoming its own kind of language between them. A language she wasn't sure she'd agreed to learn, but was apparently learning anyway. 2 days left. That was what she was thinking. She was always thinking it, underneath whatever else she was doing. 2 days left, and then 1 day left, and then whatever came after that, which she still hadn't figured out. "I need to go into town," she said. Elias looked up. "I need to talk to someone at the land office, someone who isn't in Hale's pocket, if there is such a person." She poured 2 cups of coffee. "There might not be." "What are you hoping to find?" "The original deed. Thomas filed it himself before we were married. His name, his father's name, all the right dates. If Hale's papers claim a debt from 5 years ago, and I can show the deed was clear at that time, She stopped because she was explaining something she'd already explained to herself 4 times and still didn't know if it would work. It probably won't be enough. Probably not by itself, Elias agreed. She looked at him. But you think I should go anyway? I think you should have every piece of paper that's yours in your hand before the 3 days are up, he said. Even if you don't know yet how to use them. She went to town. She left Clara in charge, which was not a decision that required much thought. Clara had been functionally in charge of her younger sisters since she was 9 years old, and managed it with a grim competence that Margaret simultaneously relied on and worried about. She told Elias he could keep working on whatever he thought needed doing, or he could rest, and she said that second part in a way that made it clear she didn't actually expect him to rest. The ride into Ash Hollow took 40 minutes in good weather. In January, with 2 inches of new snow on the road, it took closer to an hour, and the whole way there, Margaret rehearsed arguments in her head and discarded them one by one. By the time she reached the edge of town, she had settled on simply asking for what she needed in the plainest possible language, without apology or embellishment, because in her experience, that was the approach most likely to get things from people who had the power to give or withhold them. The land office was a narrow room that smelled of dust and old paper and the particular mustiness of records that people consulted only when things had gone wrong. The clerk behind the counter was a man named Aldous Finch, who was approximately 60 years old and had worked in that room for most of them, and had the careful, slightly defeated look of a man who had spent his career watching other men use paper to do things to people. He knew who she was. Everyone in Ash Hollow knew who she was. She was Thomas Whitlock's widow, which in this town meant she was a woman who had survived something difficult and was therefore either admirable or pitiful, depending on who was doing the looking. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Finch," she said, I need to see the original filing on the Whitlock homestead. Thomas Whitlock, filed in 1871. I need to see it today." Finch's expression didn't change, which she had learned meant he was deciding something. "Victor Hale has been in," he said finally, "earlier this week." "I know he has," she said. "That's why I'm here." Finch looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and went to the shelves behind him. He was gone for a few minutes, long enough that Margaret had time to look at the wall and think about whether she was going to cry, and to decide that she was not, and to think about the girls at home, and to think about Elias working in the cold, and to think about Thomas, who had filed these papers 11 years ago with his own hands, probably on a day not unlike this one, cold and uncertain and trying. Finch came back with a folder. He laid it on the counter and opened it and stepped back, which meant he was giving her room to look without making it look like he was giving her anything. She looked. The original deed was there. Thomas's signature, his father's countersignature, the date, March 1871, clear title, no encumbrances listed, no debts, no liens. She looked at the date on Hale's papers. The debt, he claimed, was from December 1873. "Can I have a copy of this?" she asked. Finch hesitated. "Mr. Finch?" she said. She kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even when she wanted to be something other than even. "That deed is a public record. It's my family's name on it. I am asking for a copy of a public record." He made the copy himself. His handwriting was small and precise, and he didn't rush it, which she appreciated. When he handed it to her, he didn't say anything, but he held the paper for just a fraction of a second before releasing it, a small and probably unconscious pressure, and she thought that meant something. "Be careful," he said, which was either general advice or specific advice, and she chose to take it as both. She rode home. The copy was tucked inside her coat, against her chest, which was both practical, it kept the paper dry, and something else, something she didn't examine too closely. She held the horse to a pace that was faster than comfortable and slower than reckless, which was roughly how she'd been doing everything for the past 3 years. When she got back, she found Elias on the roof. He was working on the section over the kitchen, the worst of the 3 problem areas he'd identified that first morning, and he was moving with that same unhurried precision she'd been watching all week. He had jury-rigged a system with ropes and the lumber from the barn to give himself something to brace against on the pitch, and it looked precarious from below, the kind of improvised solution that was either smart or dangerous, and was probably both. "You're going to fall," Clara said from the porch, in the tone of someone making an objective observation rather than expressing concern. "Probably not today," Elias said without looking down. Clara considered this. That's not very reassuring. It's honest, though. Clara looked at Margaret, who had just dismounted. He's been up there since you left, she said. I can see that. He also fixed the gate on the pig pen and reinforced the south wall of the barn and said he thinks there might be a water issue under the east foundation, but he wants to look at it more before he says anything definite. Margaret looked up at the roof. Is there a water issue under the east foundation? Might be, Elias said. He was hammering something with clean, careful strokes. I'd rather look than guess. She thought about that for a moment. She was a person who wanted information before drawing conclusions, and it was refreshing and slightly unsettling to encounter that quality in someone else, particularly someone who had appeared on her porch 4 days ago with split boots and a coat that owed her nothing. Come down when you're done, she said. I have something to show you. He came down 20 minutes later. His hands were cold, but he'd gotten the worst of the damaged section secured, and he said he could finish the rest tomorrow if the weather held, which was Wyoming's way of saying if the weather didn't decide to do something else entirely. She spread the copy of the deed on the kitchen table. He looked at it. He looked at it for longer than she expected, not because he was reading slowly, but because he was reading carefully, which were different things. The date gap, he said. 2.5 years between the clear title and the date of the supposed debt, she said. You'd need someone to testify to Thomas's financial situation in that period, Elias said. Someone who knew him, knew his accounts. There's a man named Garrett Webb. He ran the general store. Thomas did business with him going back to before we were married. He knows Thomas never borrowed money from Victor Hale because Thomas didn't trust Victor Hale from the day he arrived in this valley. She stopped. But Webb won't testify. Elias looked up from the paper. He's afraid, she said. They all are. Hale has a way of making things difficult for people who push back against him. Webb has a family. His oldest son had some trouble a while back, some business dispute that came out looking like fraud, and everyone in town knew Hale manufactured it, but the damage was done. Webb won't risk it again. Has anyone asked him recently? She opened her mouth, closed it. The truth was she hadn't asked him. She'd assumed, based on what had happened 2 years ago, based on the look on his face the last time she'd tried to discuss Hale in his store, based on the way he'd changed the subject and found something urgent to look at behind the counter. She'd assumed, and she'd stopped there. No, she said. Not recently. Elias folded his hands on the table. Then that's something to do tomorrow, he said. Hale's men will be watching the road into town, she said. If they see me going back a second time in 2 days, they'll see you going about your business, Elias said. Which is what you are doing. She looked at him across the table. You're not afraid of him, she said. It wasn't a question exactly. More like something she was noting aloud to see what he'd do with it. He looked back at her steadily. No, he said. Most people in this valley are. I know. Why aren't you? Something shifted in his face. Not much. A small recalibration, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd been watching someone carefully for several days, which she had been. I've dealt with men like Hale before, he said. He said it without drama, flatly, the way you state a fact about the weather. But the flatness itself was the thing. It was the flatness of someone who could say this without needing to elaborate, without needing you to be impressed by it. She wanted to ask what that meant. She didn't ask. I'll go to Webb's tomorrow, she said. First thing. She went to Webb's the next morning. She left before the girls were up, which she hated, but she left a note for Clara, which Clara would read and understand and manage, with the self-sufficiency that was Clara's particular gift and burden. She told herself she'd be back by noon. She was not back by noon. What happened at Garrett Webb's store was this. She walked in, and he looked at her with the expression she'd expected, the guarded, sympathetic, apologetic expression of a man who had already decided what he was going to say, and she said, before he could say anything, I know what you're going to tell me. I'm not going to ask you to testify. I just need to know if what I think is true. That's all. No one has to know we talked. Webb looked at the door behind her, at the window, at the empty street outside in the gray morning. Thomas never owed Hale money, she said. You knew his accounts. You know what he had and what he owed. Am I right? Webb said nothing for a very long moment. His hands were on the counter and she could see them pressing into the wood, knuckles whitening slightly, which was the hands doing what the voice was not permitted to do. You're right, he said finally, very quietly. Just those two words, like he was setting something down that he'd been holding for a long time. She let that sit for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Margaret," he said. "I can't—" "I know," she said. "I'm not asking." She meant it when she said it. But on the ride home, with the cold coming through her coat and the road empty ahead of her and two words echoing in her head, "You're right, you're right, you're right," she thought about what it meant to have a truth that no one would speak aloud, and how a truth like that was both everything and nothing, and how Victor Hale understood this better than most people, which was why he'd spent 3 years being so very careful about which truths could be spoken in this valley and which ones couldn't. She was halfway home when she saw the riders. 3 of them, coming from the east, which was the direction of Hale's main property. They weren't moving fast. They were moving at exactly the pace that suggested they were going somewhere specific and had plenty of time to get there. She recognized the one in the lead, a man named Cord Plimmer, who was Hale's headman, a former county deputy whose badge had been quietly revoked 4 years ago in circumstances that were vague and uncomfortable for everyone involved. Plimmer had a long, bony face and the habit of smiling with just the right side of his mouth, which gave him the expression of someone who found something faintly funny that you hadn't noticed yet. He saw her on the road and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. Very pleasant, very relaxed. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Plimmer," she said. She kept the horse moving. She did not stop. "Mr. Hale wanted me to remind you about tomorrow," Plimmer said, turning his horse to match her pace for a few steps. "In case it had slipped your mind." "It hadn't," she said. "Good." That half smile. "He's accommodating. He really is. He doesn't want any unpleasantness. He just wants—" "I know what he wants," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was something she'd worked at for a long time. "Tell him I heard him the first time." Plimmer stopped his horse and let her ride ahead. She didn't look back. She could feel the 3 of them watching her, and she kept her back straight and her pace even, and she looked at the road in front of her and thought about one thing at a time. Get home. That was the first thing. She got home. Elias was in the yard when she rode in. He'd been working on the East Foundation, checking what he'd suspected about the drainage, and he had dirt on his hands and a line between his brows that she was beginning to recognize as his thinking expression, the one that meant he'd found something that didn't sit right and was working out what to do about it. He looked at her face. "What happened?" he said. She swung down from the horse and took a breath. "Plimmer found me on the road. Hale's man. I was reminding me about tomorrow." Elias's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it sharpened. "He was just talking," she said. "No threats. He's too careful for that." "Men like Plimmer don't need to threaten," Elias said. "The showing up is the threat." "I know that." She handed him the reins without thinking, an automatic gesture, the kind you made with people you'd started to trust without consciously deciding to, and then noticed what she'd done and thought about it for a moment and decided not to take it back. He led the horse toward the barn. She followed. "Webb confirmed it," she said to his back. "Won't testify, but he confirmed Thomas never owed Hale anything." "That's something." "It's not enough." "No," he agreed. He started unsaddling the horse with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it thousands of times. Not by itself. She leaned against the stall gate. "So what do I do tomorrow? When they come?" "You don't move," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was running his hand along the horse's flank, checking the animal's condition, the way you check things you were responsible for. "You stand in your doorway. You tell them you're not going anywhere. You make them be the ones to act first." "And if they act first?" He was quiet for a moment. The horse shifted under his hand. "I'll be here," he said. She looked at the side of his face, at the line of his jaw, the particular set of his shoulders, the hands moving over the horse with that same economy she'd been watching all week. A man who worked like he'd done everything more than once and had stopped needing to prove it. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "Who are you?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his eyes. Not evasion, not quite, but something more like a door that was locked not because of dishonesty, but because of caution, because of a reason she couldn't see yet. "I told you," he said. "I'm Elias Boone." "That's your name," she said. "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. "It's what I can tell you right now," he said. very quietly, with something in it that was almost an apology. She thought about pressing. She had the instinct for it. She was a woman who dealt in information, who felt the edges of missing things, and couldn't help running her fingers along them. But there was something in the way he said it, not defensive, not deceptive, more like a man who had a reason and believed she would understand it if she knew it, that made her stop. "All right," she said. She went inside. The girls were at the table. Nora had made a production of setting out the cups. Ruth was pretending to read but was actually watching the door, which meant she'd been watching for Margaret to come back and would deny it if asked. Clara was doing something practical. Mending, it looked like, working on the knee of Nora's spare pair of trousers, with the patient, slightly resigned competence she brought to everything. "You were gone a long time," Nora said. "I had things to do," Margaret said. "Elias fixed the window above the wash basin," Ruth said, still looking at her book. "The one that leaked." "I know." "He didn't say he was going to do it. He just did it." "I know," Margaret said again. She sat down at the table. The four of them were quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a family that has gotten used to managing its own weight together, and Margaret looked at her three daughters and thought about what tomorrow meant and what she was going to protect and how. The night passed slow. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds the house made, the wind, the wood settling, the faint and steady sound of breathing from the room where all three girls slept together in one bed for warmth. She listened to the silence from the kitchen where Elias lay awake, because she knew he was awake. She didn't know how she knew, she just knew. Sometime in the small hours she heard him get up, heard him put on his coat, heard the barn door, the repaired barn door, smooth now, silent, open and close. She lay there for a while thinking about whether to follow. She didn't follow. He came back 20 minutes later. She heard him take off his coat, heard him settle back down. She heard nothing after that. In the morning, she would find that he'd walked the perimeter of the property in the snow. She could see his tracks when she went out at dawn, a clear circuit around the entire boundary, deliberate and thorough. Why a drifter would walk the perimeter of someone else's land at 2 in the morning. In the middle of winter was something she could not explain. She spent 15 minutes trying to explain it and then stopped trying. She made breakfast. She woke the girls. She stood at the window and looked at the road. An hour before noon, the riders came. There were 7 of them this time, not 3. 7, which was not the number you brought if you were making a reminder call. 7 was the number you brought if you had decided that the reminder period was over. Plimmer was at the front. The others were men she didn't know, or knew only by sight, the kind of men who appeared when there was work that required more hands than conscience. Behind her, she heard Clara come to stand in the kitchen doorway. "Mama," Clara said. "I see them," Margaret said. She didn't move from the window. The riders came into the yard. Plimmer dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who'd done this before and expected no surprises. He had a rolled paper in his hand, which was either the legal notice or something designed to look like one, and it didn't matter which because the paper wasn't really the point. The paper was just the excuse to have 7 men in someone's yard. Margaret put on her coat. "Stay inside," she said to Clara. "Mama." "Inside, Clara. All 3 of you." She looked at her oldest daughter and held the look for just a second, long enough for Clara to understand that she meant it, and also long enough for something else to pass between them that didn't have words. Then she opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her like it always did, all at once and without apology. Plimmer looked up at her with that half-smile. "Mrs. Whitlock, I believe you know why we're here." "I know why you think you're here," she said. "You're not taking this ranch." Plimmer's smile held steady. He had the patience of a man who'd played this scene before and knew how it ended. "Ma'am, the legal notice is based on a fraudulent debt," she said, "and you know that as well as I do. Now, I don't think—" "You're not here to think," she said. "You're here to intimidate a widow with 3 children in the house. And I want you to be very clear that it isn't working." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that later. In the moment, she was too focused to be proud of anything, but later she would remember the steadiness and be glad of it. Plimmer lost a small fraction of his smile. Not all of it, but enough that she noticed. Then, from behind her, the porch steps creaked. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Elias Boone stepped up beside her on the porch and stood there with his arms loose at his sides, and looked at the 7 riders in the yard with the same calm expression he brought to everything, the expression she'd stopped trying to read and started simply relying on. Plimmer looked at him. Something passed across Plimmer's face, something she couldn't name. Not quite recognition, or maybe it was, but a recognition that came with complications she wasn't privy to. "Who are you?" Plimmer said. "Nobody important?" Elias said. He said it the same way he said everything, quietly, without performance. Plimmer studied him for a long moment. His half-smile was entirely gone now. He looked at Elias the way you look at something you're trying to place, something that has a shape you've seen before but can't immediately locate. "Mr. Hale's notice stands," Plimmer said, but his voice had shifted. "Not much. Enough." "The lady told you it's a fraudulent debt," Elias said. "You heard her. That's not for—" "She also told you she's not leaving," Elias said. "So you have 2 choices. You can serve your paper and ride back and tell your employer that the notice was delivered and no one moved. Or you can try to make something happen here, with 3 children in that house, and I want you to think carefully about how you'd like that to go." The yard was very quiet. One of the horses shifted. Snow creaked somewhere on the roof. Plimmer looked at Elias for a long moment. His men were watching both of them. Margaret could feel the weight of the moment, the way it balanced on something invisible, something that could go either way. Plimmer made a decision. He stepped forward and held out the paper. Margaret took it. She took it with both hands and held his gaze while she did it, and didn't look down at the paper. "Tomorrow," Plimmer said. "I heard you the first time," she said. He turned and mounted his horse. The 7 men turned with him, and they rode out of the yard in the same unhurried way they'd arrived, because the unhurriedness was part of it. That was how you showed people you had no reason to rush. When they were gone, Margaret's hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until now. She put the paper under her arm and pressed her hands together and took a breath of cold air. Elias was looking at the road where the riders had gone. "You called their bluff," she said. "They called mine," he said quietly, and backed down. She looked at the side of his face, the line of his jaw, the eyes that were tracking something in the middle distance that she couldn't see. "Plimmer recognized you," she said, "or almost did. I saw his face." Elias said nothing. "Nothing. Elias." He looked at her. His expression had the quality of a door that was about to open, she thought. Not open, just about to. That fraction of a second before. "Tomorrow," he said. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know that. Are you ready for that?" She looked at him. She thought about Thomas and the blizzard, and 3 winters of carrying everything alone, and 1 small loaf of bread, and a child who gave away her last piece without being asked, and a deed with the right dates on it folded against her chest. "I've been ready," she said. "I've been ready for a long time." She went back inside. Behind her, Elias stood on the porch a moment longer. He was looking at the road. He was thinking about something that had nothing to do with fences or roofs or water drainage, something that had been building for years in a direction Margaret Whitlock didn't know yet. The sun was already low. Tomorrow was almost here. That night, nobody slept well. Margaret lay in the dark and listened to the house the way she'd been listening to it for 3 years, cataloging its sounds the way a person catalogs the sounds of something they're afraid of losing. The wood settling, the wind finding the gap above the wash basin, the gap Elias had fixed, she reminded herself, and the wind found nothing there now, just sealed wood and cold air sliding off it. Small things. She'd started noticing small things differently this week. She thought about tomorrow. She'd been thinking about tomorrow since the moment Plimmer rode out of the yard, but she'd been thinking about it the way you think about a wall you can see coming and can't find a way around. She had the deed copy. She had Webb's 2 words. She had a drifter on her kitchen floor who moved like something she couldn't name, and looked at Cord Plimmer like Plimmer was a minor inconvenience in a life full of larger ones. She didn't have enough. She knew she didn't have enough. She'd known it for 2 days, and she'd kept moving anyway because stopping felt worse than moving in the wrong direction, and because her daughters were watching her the way daughters watch their mothers when everything is uncertain, looking for information about how to hold themselves. At some point before dawn, she heard Elias get up. She heard him stand by the window for a while, not moving. Then she heard him sit back down. He didn't go outside this time. She thought about calling out to him. She didn't. Morning came gray and still, the particular stillness that sometimes preceded weather, and sometimes just proceeded whatever the day had decided to be. Margaret was up before the girls. Coffee made, fire built, coat by the door. She stood at the window and looked at the road and drank her coffee and didn't let herself think too far ahead, just to the next hour and then the next. Elias came in from outside, snow on his shoulders. He'd been up and out without her hearing him leave, which was becoming a pattern she'd stopped questioning. He sat down at the table without taking his coat off. "How many men does Hale have?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. 10, maybe 12 that work for him regular, plus he can hire." She set a cup in front of him. "Why?" "Because if he's coming today and he's serious about it, he won't send 7, Elias said. "He'll send everyone he has." She looked at him. "He did the polite version yesterday," Elias said. "Plimmer with a paper. That's the version for when he thinks someone will fold. You didn't fold." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "So today's different." Margaret sat down across from him. She looked at the table between them, at the grain of the wood, at the ring left by 10,000 cups of morning coffee, Thomas's cups and her cups, and someday the girls' cups if she could keep this table in this house. "What do we do?" she said. "Tell me about the valley," Elias said. "The other ranches, the families." She looked up. "What about them?" "Who's he taken from before you?" She thought. "Henderson's, east of here. Old man Henderson had 300 acres. Hale's had it for 2 years. Henderson's living with his daughter in Nebraska now." She paused. "Before that, the Crane family. The widow Crane, actually. She left the winter before last. I don't know where she went." She paused again, longer. "The Pickett brothers. Lou Bautista. The family that had the mill property south of town. I can't remember their name. They were only here 2 seasons. Elias was quiet, listening. "There are others," she said. "Small ones. People who didn't fight. People who took what he offered them and left because it was easier than staying and finding out what happened if they didn't." She looked at her coffee. "I don't blame them." "How many families are still in the valley that he's pressured?" She thought about it. "The Farnsworth place, South Pasture, Webb at the store. You know about Webb. There's a man named August Cole who runs cattle on the ridge. Hale's been trying to get his water rights for a year and a half. Cole won't sell." She paused. "He won't fight either, though. He just says no and locks his door." "Does Cole know about the others? Does any of them know what Hale's done across the whole valley, all of it put together?" She started to say yes and then stopped, because the answer was no. Not really. They all knew pieces. They knew their own piece, and they knew rumors, and they knew the general shape of what Hale was doing the way you know the general shape of a thing in fog. But nobody had sat down and laid all the pieces next to each other in one place. "No," she said. "That's the problem," Elias said. "That's always the problem with men like Hale. They work on people one at a time. They make sure nobody sees the whole picture. Because if you see the whole picture..." He stopped. "It's harder to believe you're the only one," she said, "and harder to believe there's no one to stand with." He looked at her. "I'm not slow," she said. "I know you're not." She looked out the window. The road was still empty. For now. "So you think if the others, if they saw all of it together..." "I think frightened people need to feel less alone," Elias said. "That's not complicated. It's just true." She thought about this. She thought about Webb in his store, and August Cole locking his door, and the Henderson farm standing empty east of here with snow drifting against a fence that nobody tended anymore. "Even if every one of them agreed," she said slowly, "even if Cole and Webb and whoever else came and stood here today, Hale has men. He has the judge. He has paper." "Paper can be wrong," Elias said. "And the judge in this county doesn't have jurisdiction over everything." He looked at the table. "There's a territorial commissioner, lands and deeds. He doesn't answer to county judges." She went still. "His name is Aldous Perch," Elias said. "He's based in Cheyenne. He's an honest man as far as honest men go." A pause. "He doesn't like Victor Hale." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" The briefest flicker of something across his face. "I know a lot of things about this territory," he said carefully. "Elias." Her voice had an edge now, not anger, something closer to the specific frustration of a person who has been patient longer than feels reasonable. "Who are you? Don't tell me you're a drifter." I stopped believing that 4 days ago. I'm not sure I believed it on the first night. She held his gaze. You walked the perimeter of my property at 2 in the morning. You know the name of the territorial commissioner. You looked at Cord Plimmer yesterday, and he recognized you, or he almost did. I saw it. Elias held her gaze for a long moment. The silence stretched in a way that had weight. I need you to trust me for one more day, he said. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. I know that. He looked down at the table briefly, then back up. What I can tell you is that I'm not here to hurt you or take anything from you or use you for something. And I think you know that. She did know that. She knew it. And it made her angrier, not less, because it would have been easier to be properly suspicious of a man she didn't trust. One more day, she said. One more day. She stood up from the table. She went to the girls' room and stood in the doorway and looked at the three of them still asleep in the gray morning light. Nora with her mouth slightly open, one arm thrown over Ruth's shoulder without knowing it, Ruth straight and contained even in sleep. Clara on her back, already showing the signs of waking, the slight furrow of the brow, the preparatory tension. One more day. She went back to the kitchen. What do we do this morning? She said. I need to send a message, Elias said. She looked at him. To who? Someone who can get here by afternoon, he said. He stood up and reached for her writing paper on the shelf by the window, the paper she used for accounts and letters. And he stopped with his hand on it and looked at her, asking. She nodded. He took the paper and sat back down and wrote quickly, in a hand that was clean and deliberate, not the hand of a man who struggled with letters. He folded it when he was done. Is there someone you trust to ride to the Cole Ranch? He asked. She thought, I can go myself. I need you here, he said. I need you visible. She thought again. Tom Healy, the boy who helps with the horses sometimes. He's 13, but he's dependable. Send him to Cole, Elias said. This letter is for Cole. Ask Cole to pass the word to whoever else is left in the valley. Tell them to come here. This afternoon. She looked at the folded letter. And what does the letter say? That it's time, Elias said. That's all. She sent Tom Healy. The boy arrived 20 minutes after she sent Clara to fetch him, appearing at the door red-cheeked from running, looking between Margaret and Elias with the bright-eyed awareness of a 13-year-old who understood that something was happening and wanted to be part of it. You ride careful, Margaret told him. You see Hale's men on the road, you go around. Don't stop for anyone. Yes, ma'am, Tom said. He took the letter and tucked it inside his coat and was gone. Margaret watched him go. Then she turned back to the yard and the road beyond it, and the gray January sky that gave nothing away. The morning was long. It was one of the longest mornings she could remember, and she'd had some long ones. The girls were inside. She'd told them to stay in, told them with the kind of firmness that didn't invite negotiation, even from Clara. Ruth sat in the corner with her book, actually reading this time, the reading of someone who needed something to hold. Nora fell asleep again on the bench, which was the particular gift of small children, that ability to sleep through the approach of disaster. Clara sat at the table and did not pretend to be doing anything. She sat with her hands folded and watched the window and waited, which was what Margaret was doing too, and in that hour Clara looked more like her mother than she ever had. Elias was outside. Margaret kept track of him through the window. He moved around the yard with his usual purposefulness, but she noticed he was positioning himself. She could see it now, choosing where to stand and where to move in a way that wasn't random. He checked the barn. He checked the gate. He stood for a while at the north edge of the yard and looked out over the property with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled against the wind. Whatever he was doing, it was not fixing things. Around 10 in the morning, 2 riders came from the south. Margaret's heart kicked before she recognized them. August Cole, on his rangy gray horse, and behind him a younger man she didn't know. One of Cole's hands, maybe, or one of the neighbors from the far south end of the valley. Cole pulled up at the yard gate and looked at Margaret on the porch. He was a big man, August Cole, wide through the shoulders, with a gray beard he trimmed badly and eyes that were sharp regardless of everything else. He'd been in this valley since before Margaret and Thomas arrived. He'd watched Hale come in and swallow property after property, and he'd said no every time Hale came to him, and he'd locked his door, and he'd done nothing else, which he knew, and Margaret knew, and they'd never discussed because there was nothing useful to say about it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her at Elias, who had come around from the north side of the yard. Cole's expression did a thing Margaret couldn't read. Not recognition. Something more complicated. "He sent the letter," Cole said. "Not to Margaret, to Elias." "I sent the letter," Elias said. Cole looked at him for a long moment. "Are you actually here?" he said, which was a strange thing to say, and Margaret filed it away. "I'm here," Elias said. Cole dismounted. He did it heavily, the way a big man dismounts when his hips have been bothering him all winter. He walked to Elias and stood in front of him and looked at him with an expression that was wrestling with something Margaret couldn't see. "You've been here all week," Cole said. "Yes." "You could have told someone." "I needed to see it myself," Elias said. "You needed—" Cole stopped. He pressed his mouth together. Something was happening between the two men that Margaret was standing outside of, and she was about to say something about it when two more riders came from the road, and then another, and then three together. By 11 o'clock there were 9 people in her yard, which was 9 more than had been in her yard at any one time since Thomas's funeral, and they stood in the cold and looked at each other with the particular unease of people who had each been alone in their own fear for so long that the company felt slightly unreal. Webb was there. She was surprised. She hadn't sent word to Webb. But Cole had apparently passed the letter further and faster than she'd thought possible, and Webb had come, standing a little apart from the others with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that was somewhere between relief and terror. Elias stood in the middle of the yard and talked to them. He wasn't a speechmaker. He didn't have the preacher's cadence or the politician's volume. He talked the way he did everything, directly, without extra words, looking at each person in turn. He told them what he knew about Hale's operation. The forged deeds, the manufactured debts, the pattern across the valley, person by person, spread across 3 years so that no one could see the whole of it at once. He talked about the Henderson farm and the Crane place and the mill property and the families who had left, and he laid it all end to end until the shape of it was unavoidable. Margaret watched the faces of her neighbors as they heard it. She watched Webb's hands tighten on his hat. She watched a woman named Dora Farnsworth, who had come with her husband from the south pasture, put her hand over her mouth. She watched August Cole stand with his arms folded and his jaw set, and she could see him rearranging things in his head, things he'd known separately suddenly connecting into something that was much uglier than any of the pieces alone. "What he's done," Elias said, "is only possible because he's done it to each of you when you were alone. That's not a coincidence. That's a method. And the thing about a method is that it only works when the conditions are right." He looked around the group. "Today the conditions change." "Change how?" Farnsworth said. He was a square, cautious man who asked questions before he moved. "We go to the judge. Hale has the judge." "Not the county judge," Elias said. "The territorial commissioner's office in Cheyenne. There's an ongoing inquiry into land fraud in this territory. It's been stalled because nobody would come forward with documentation." A pause. "If every one of you who has documentation, deeds, letters, records of any kind, puts it together in one place, with testimony to go with it, the inquiry can move." "That takes time," Cole said. "Margaret doesn't have time." "Margaret has today," Elias said, "and today we deal with today." The question of how they dealt with today was answered shortly after noon, when the sound of horses came from the road again. Not 3, not 7. Margaret counted from the window and stopped counting at 11 because they were still coming. Victor Hale rode with them for the first time. She'd seen him before, of course. Ash Hollow was small enough that you saw everyone, and Hale had been a presence in this valley for 3 years. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the florid coloring and deliberate grooming of someone who had decided his appearance was a business asset. He wore a good coat. He always wore a good coat. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the yard full of people with an expression that was working hard to stay pleasant and not entirely succeeding. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, his voice carried. He'd practiced that. "I see you've had company." "I have," she said. She was on the porch again. Elias was beside her again. The neighbors were spread across the yard, 9 of them, not hiding, just standing in their own yard on their own feet in the cold. "These are my neighbors. They've come to witness." "Witness what exactly?" "Whatever you intend to do," she said. They're here to see it. Hale looked at the group. He looked at Webb, and something moved across his face. Webb's presence was a surprise, that was clear. He looked at Cole. He looked at Farnsworth. He looked at each face with the methodical attention of a man recalculating. Then his eyes moved to Elias. He looked at Elias the way Plimmer had looked at him, but more so. Plimmer had almost recognized him. Hale looked at Elias, and something happened in his expression that was not almost. It was something Margaret had no word for, a draining of color, a sudden stillness. The particular stillness of a man who has turned a corner expecting one thing and found something entirely different. "You," Hale said. Elias said nothing. "You are—" Hale stopped. "Elias Boone," Elias said, quietly. The same way he'd said it to Nora on the first night. Not a performance, just a fact. The name meant something. Margaret could see it moving through Hale's men like a current, the name passing from one to the next in looks and small movements, and the quality of the yard changed. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. The men who had ridden in with the easy confidence of numbers were recalibrating, and it was visible if you knew what to look for. Plimmer, at Hale's right, had gone very still. "What is your business here?" Hale said. He'd recovered something of his composure, but it was the brittle composure of a man holding himself together, not the real thing. "Right now," Elias said, "I'm standing on Margaret Whitlock's porch, which is where she invited me to stand. This ranch is hers," Elias said. "By deed filed in 1871, clear title, no encumbrances, no legitimate debt." He reached into his coat and removed a folded paper. Not Margaret's copy, she noticed. A different paper, something she hadn't seen before, and held it up. "Copies of which have been sent to the Territorial Commissioner's office in Cheyenne in the last 24 hours. The silence in the yard was absolute. Hale's eyes went to the paper in Elias's hand. Margaret watched him try to read from distance what it said and fail. "You have no authority here," Hale said. "No," Elias agreed. "I don't. But I have standing." He looked at Hale steadily. "And I think you know that, Victor. I think that's why your face looks the way it does right now." It was the first time she'd heard him use someone's first name like that. Not rudely. Just as a statement of something, a refusal to observe a protocol that Hale used to maintain distance. Hale looked at him. Something was a rapid and private arithmetic. "This isn't finished," Hale said. "No," Elias said. "It's not. But it's different now." He looked around the yard, at the neighbors, at Hale's men, at the road beyond. "Everyone here has seen everyone else today. That doesn't go away." Hale's horse moved under him, a small sidestep, and he brought it back to stillness with an automatic pressure of his knee. He looked at Margaret. "This isn't finished," he said to her directly. She met his gaze. She thought about this paper Victor Hale had dropped on her kitchen table without looking at her and walked away from. She thought about the door he hadn't closed. "You never close the door behind you," she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. But it was true, and she let it stand. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the road with his men behind him, and the yard was quiet except for the sound of hoofbeats fading and the wind moving through the bare branches at the edge of the property. Nobody in the yard spoke for a moment. Then August Cole let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep in him, and the spell broke, and everyone started moving and talking at once in the way that people do when the tension drops and the body needs somewhere to put what it's been holding. Margaret didn't move. She stood on her porch and watched the road until there was nothing left to see, and then she kept standing there because she needed a moment before she could be the person everyone in the yard was looking to be something for. Her hands were still. She noticed that. After the shaking of yesterday, they were still now. Behind her, she heard Elias step back from the porch railing. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something more open than his usual careful watchfulness. Something that had the quality of relief in it, or maybe something adjacent to relief. The expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular moment and has reached it and is not entirely sure what to do now that it's arrived. "Are you all right?" he said. "No," she said. She meant it honestly, not dramatically. "But I think I will be." A nodded like that was a reasonable answer. Around them, her neighbors were talking among themselves. The low, urgent talk of people who have just discovered they are not alone and are adjusting to that discovery. Webb had moved to stand beside Cole, and they were talking in low voices, and whatever they were saying, Webb's hands were quiet, not gripping anything, not pressing into a counter, just at his sides. Margaret stepped down from the porch. She moved among her neighbors because they were in her yard, and they had come when they didn't have to, and that deserved acknowledgement. She thanked each of them. She shook Farnsworth's hand. She stood next to Webb for a moment and didn't say anything, which was the right choice, and he nodded at her once, which was his. Later, when they had gone, she found herself back in the kitchen. The girls had emerged after the writers left. Nora immediately and with questions, Ruth behind her with fewer questions and sharper ones, Clara last and with none, because Clara had watched from the window and already had her answers. Nora wanted to know if the bad men were gone. "For now," Margaret said. "Will they come back?" "Maybe," Margaret said. She believed in answering Nora honestly because Nora was going to figure it out anyway, and preferred reality to comfortable vagueness. Nora thought about this. "But Elias will be here," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of the world as Nora understood it to currently be arranged. Margaret looked at Elias, who was sitting at the table and had heard this, and whose face did the thing it had done on the first night when Nora held out her bread across the table. That thing that was not quite a smile and was not quite pain, and was something underneath both of them. "I'll be here," he said to Nora. Nora nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Ruth was watching Elias from across the room. Ruth had been watching him the whole week, and Margaret had noticed without saying anything, because Ruth needed to watch. It was how Ruth processed the world, through sustained, patient observation, and it was not something to interrupt. "You knew Mr. Hale," Ruth said, "from before." Elias looked at her. He had a particular quality of attention when Ruth spoke to him. More careful than with the others, more waiting. He'd noticed what Ruth was. Maybe from the first day. "We've crossed paths," he said. "He was afraid of you," Ruth said. "Ruth," Margaret said. "He was," Ruth said. "I saw it from the window. He wasn't afraid of the neighbors. He was afraid of Elias." Elias was quiet for a moment. "People are sometimes afraid of things they don't understand," he said, "or things they didn't expect." "Which one was it?" Ruth said. A pause. "Both, maybe." Ruth looked at him for a long moment with her measuring gaze. Then she picked up her book and went back to reading, which meant she'd gotten what she needed. Clara said nothing. Clara had been watching Elias since he said, "I'll be here," to Nora, and she was still watching him now. And her expression was not the calculating expression she usually wore, but something more open, more uncertain, which on Clara's face was somehow more affecting than anything. She looked at her mother. Margaret looked back. What passed between them in that look was not anything that could be said in words, and neither of them tried. It was just an acknowledgement, mother and daughter, of something that was changing in this house, something that neither of them had expected and neither of them was entirely sure what to do with yet. That evening, after supper, Elias stayed at the table after the girls had gone to bed. Margaret made coffee because it was something to do with her hands. She put a cup in front of him and sat down across from him, and they were quiet for a while in the particular way they'd gotten quiet together, the way that had developed over a week of proximity and mutual purpose without either of them designing it. "Tomorrow," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "Hale is going to go a different direction now. He knows he can't just walk up with papers and men. He'll go legal. He'll try to find something, anything. Let him," Elias said. "Every move he makes now gets seen, by Cole, by Webb, by the people who were in your yard today." He looked at his coffee. "And the commissioner's office has the documentation." She looked at him. "The letter you sent?" "Yes." "To Commissioner Perch?" "Yes." She turned her cup slowly. She was working up to something, and he could probably tell because he went still in the way he went still when he was waiting. "Elias," she said, "who are you, really? I'm not asking for tomorrow or next week or because it changes anything. I'm asking because I have been honest with you about everything, and I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think I deserve the same." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and then something in him changed, visibly, the way a door changes when the lock slides back. Not open yet, but no longer what it was a moment ago. He opened his mouth to speak, and from outside, sudden and violent, came the sound of glass shattering. Margaret was on her feet before the echo stopped. Elias was already moving, across the room and to the window, pressing himself to the wall beside it, and looking out at the angle that let him see without being seen, and she recognized the motion as something trained, something practiced, something no ordinary drifter had ever learned. On the wall opposite the window, the broken glass of the small lamp she kept on the sill lay scattered across the floor, and through the jagged hole where the window had been, cold air poured in and with it the smell of something burning. "Back door," Elias said. His voice was completely different now. Still quiet, but with a different quality. Stripped of everything that wasn't necessary, clean and direct and carrying something she'd never heard in it before. "Get the girls and take the back door. Now!" "What?" "Fire," he said. "Barn." She went for the girls. She had all three of them out of bed and moving in under a minute, Clara understanding without being told and taking Nora's hand, Ruth grabbing her shoes, Margaret doing the coats, everything in the dark because she didn't stop for the lamp, moving by feel through a house she'd lived in for 11 years. She got them to the back door and opened it, and cold air hit all four of them, and Nora made a sound but didn't cry, and then Margaret looked back. The barn was lit from inside. Not completely, not fully engulfed, but the glow was wrong, orange and moving, and the smell was unmistakable. She turned to Clara. "Take them to the Healy place. Don't stop. Don't look back." "Mama." "Now Clara." Clara went. She took her sisters and she went, and she didn't look back because Clara was Clara, and she understood that some instructions were absolute. Margaret turned toward the barn. Elias was already there. She didn't know how he'd gotten there before her. She didn't stop to figure it out. She ran across the yard, and the cold hit her without her coat, and she didn't notice, and the barn door was open, and inside there was smoke, and the sound of the cattle panicking in their stalls. And somewhere at the back of the loft something was burning. Not big yet, not big enough to be unstoppable, but real. Elias had the first animal out before she reached the door. He handed her a rope without looking at her and went back in. They worked. It was not smooth, it was not organized. It was two people in smoke and low firelight doing what needed doing by feel and instinct. And Margaret's eyes burned and her lungs burned and she coughed almost continuously and kept moving anyway. And at some point she couldn't see Elias and could only hear him, the sounds of gates opening and cattle moving, and one shouted direction when the smoke thickened and she'd started going the wrong way. She came back the right way. The fire at the back of the loft was manageable. Manageable the way a fire is manageable when you're not late. She could see what it was, a bundle of straw at the base of the wall, deliberately placed, already burning through to the first beam. She grabbed the nearest water bucket. Elias had filled the buckets that morning, she remembered. She'd watched him do it and thought it was routine, and threw it, and then another. And then Elias was beside her with a third, and the fire guttered and didn't die but halved itself. And then he went back and came back with two more. And between the five of them, it became smoke, thick and ugly and choking. But smoke, not fire, smoke. They stood in the barn in the dark and the smoke breathing hard, and the cattle were outside in the cold stamping and protesting, and from somewhere down the road a dog was barking, and Margaret's hands were shaking again, not with fear this time, with something else. The aftermath of effort, the body accounting for what it had just asked of itself. She looked at Elias. He was looking at the base of the wall where the fire had been, at the burned straw. At the deliberate placement of it. "Someone set this," she said. "Yes," he said. "Hail." "His men," Elias said. "He wouldn't be here himself." He looked at the wall, at the beam that had started to catch, and hadn't had time to go further. He was very still now, that quality of stillness she knew by now, but different, colder. "He wanted to take your animals, ruin the barn, make it impossible for you to stay, even if you kept the land." She looked at the burned base of the wall, at the saved barn, at the cattle outside in the cold who were going to need to be brought back in, a task that was going to be cold and slow and difficult. "He almost managed it," she said. "Almost," Elias said. She looked at him. In the glow of the last of the burning straw dying down to embers, in the smoke and the cold, in the wreckage of what could have been and wasn't. She looked at him and she thought about all the things she didn't know yet, all the doors that were locked, all the things he wasn't telling her. She thought about a man who set water buckets in the morning before a fire at night that he had no way to predict. Or maybe he had. The perimeter, she said. Last night. You weren't just walking. He looked at her. You were looking for something, she said. You checked the barn specifically. I saw your tracks this morning. You went around the barn twice. He didn't say anything. You knew they might do this, she said, or something like this. He held her gaze. I thought it was possible, he said carefully. So you filled the buckets. I filled the buckets, he said. She looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she turned and walked to the barn door and looked out at the cattle in the dark yard and the cold sky above them. And she said, without turning back, help me get them in. They got the cattle in. It took 40 minutes and was exactly as cold and slow and difficult as she'd known it would be. But they were in. The barn was cold and smoky, and it was going to need work in the morning, but it was standing, and everything that needed to be inside, it was inside it. When it was done, she stood at the barn door and looked at the house, dark and intact, the lamp out because she hadn't lit it again. Your girls, Elias said. I'll get them from the Healy place, she said. She looked at the road. They're safe. She stood there for a moment. Elias, she said. Yes. Tomorrow, she said. Whatever you were going to tell me before the window broke. Tomorrow, you're going to tell me. He was quiet for exactly one breath. Yes, he said. She nodded. She went to get her girls. The Healy place was a quarter-mile down the road, and Margaret covered it at a pace that wasn't quite running, but was close enough that her breath came in hard white bursts by the time she reached the door. Clara answered before she knocked. She'd been watching from the window, which was Clara, always watching, always positioned to see what was coming. The three girls came out into the cold, and Margaret put her arms around all of them at once in the graceless, insufficient way that you hold three people when you only have two arms. And Nora pressed her face into Margaret's coat, and Ruth stood straight and let herself be held with the controlled stillness of a child who had decided that composure was the same as strength. And Clara put her forehead briefly against her mother's shoulder, just for a second, before she straightened back up. The barn? Clara said. Standing, Margaret said. Clara exhaled. One small breath of relief that she didn't try to hide, which was more than she usually gave herself. Tom Healy's mother appeared in the doorway, a wide, sensible woman named Edna, who had 4 children of her own and the calm demeanor of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by crisis. She looked at Margaret and at the smoke smell that had come in with them, and she didn't ask questions. They can stay the night, Edna said, all 4 of you. Just the girls, Margaret said. I need to go back. Edna looked at her for a moment. That man of yours is still there? The phrasing caught Margaret slightly off guard. That man of yours. She didn't correct it. Yes, she said. Then go, Edna said. The girls are fine here. Margaret looked at her daughters. Nora had already migrated toward the warmth inside, pulled by the smell of something on the stove. Ruth was watching her mother with an expression that held a question Margaret didn't have time to answer right now. Clara met her eyes and nodded once. She went back. The yard was quiet when she returned. The cattle were settled. The barn door was shut. Elias was sitting on the porch steps when she came through the gate, elbows on his knees, looking at nothing in particular, and he straightened when he saw her but didn't stand. She sat down beside him on the steps. They were both cold. The cold was the kind that had gotten into clothing and was working on skin, and neither of them suggested going inside. Sometimes you needed to sit in the thing that had just happened for a few minutes before you could carry it indoors. They won't do it again tonight, Elias said. They did what they came to do, or tried to. How do you know they won't come back? Because men like that don't repeat the same move in the same night. It's too visible. He looked at the road. Hale wants this to look like business. Arson twice in one night stops looking like business. She thought about this. The sheriff will want to report. The sheriff in this county, Elias said. I know, she said. I know what you mean. She looked at her hands. The cold had made them clumsy and she flexed them slowly. There's a deputy, Jesse Varn. He's not Hale's man, or he wasn't, as of a year ago. I can't speak to what Hale may have offered him since then. It's worth trying. In the morning. In the morning, he agreed. She sat there for a moment. The sky above them was clear now, the storm that had threatened all day having gone some other direction, and the stars were visible in a way they rarely were in January, hard and bright, and very far away. "You were going to tell me something," she said, "before the window." He was quiet. "I'm not going to let you defer it again," she said. She said it without edge, just as a statement of fact. "I've been patient, and I've trusted you, and I think I've earned a straight answer." He looked at the road for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. "Iron Ridge Ranch," he said. She waited. "It's about 140 miles northwest of here. Been operating since 1868. About 8,000 acres of deeded land, another 12,000 in grazing rights." He said it the way you read something from a page, flat and factual, as though the distance helped. "It runs about 2,000 head most years. I have 34 men working it, permanent staff. More in the spring and summer." The silence stretched. Margaret sat very still. "It's mine," he said. "Has been since my father died in 1874. He built the first structures. I built the rest." He paused. "My name is Elias Boone." That part was true. Everything I told you about my name was true. She looked at him. He looked back. "You're not a drifter," she said. It came out quiet. "Not angry. Not yet." "No," he said. "You own one of the largest ranches in this territory." "Yes." She sat with this for a moment. The information was settling through her in layers, the way cold settles, each layer changing what was underneath it. "The territorial commissioner," she said. "Perch. You know him." "We've done business," Elias said. "He's a fair man. He genuinely doesn't like Hale. They had a confrontation 3 years ago over water rights in the Northern District, before Hale started moving south." A pause. "I wrote to Perch 6 days ago, before I arrived here." She turned to look at him. "Before?" "Yes. You were coming here." He met her gaze. "I was coming to this valley. I'd heard about what Hale was doing. I'd seen it happen in the north, and I knew the pattern. I came to see for myself what the situation was, and to—" He stopped. "To do something about it if I could." "But you didn't tell anyone who you were," she said. "No." "Why?" He looked away. She waited. "Because when people know who I am, they act differently," he said. "They defer to me, or they resent me, or they want something from me. And I can't see a situation clearly when people are performing for it." He turned back to her. "I needed to see what was actually happening, not the version people present to a man who owns 8,000 acres and has the territorial commissioner's ear." She looked at him for a long moment. "And when you knocked on my door?" "I was on foot because I'd left my horse and my gear at a camp 3 miles north. I didn't want to arrive on a good horse and a good coat." He paused. "The boots are actually mine. They're old. I kept them for— I don't know why I kept them. I kept them." She looked at the boots on his feet, the split toe she'd noticed on the first night. "The coat," she said. "Traded for it in town. The split in the toe." "Real," he said. "It happened." She turned back to the road. She was processing something. He let her process it. That much he'd learned about her in a week. "You ate 2/3 of a plate of food," she said. He said nothing. "When you were hungry," she said. "You left the rest. You said in case someone wanted it later." She paused. "Was that—" "That was real," he said, quietly. "I wasn't performing that." Another pause. "I hadn't eaten in about a day and a half. I left the rest because there were 3 children at the table and I could see the bread was all there was." She looked at him. "I would have left it no matter who I was," he said. She sat with that. She thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean, and about the week that had just passed, every hour of it, the work and the quiet, and the conversations in the dark, and the shoulder she'd fought alongside in a burning barn. She thought about what was real and what was performed, and how you told the difference. She thought about Nora handing him her bread. "She knew," Margaret said. Elias blinked. "What?" "Nora." She almost smiled. "She knew something. Children that age know things they don't have words for. She looked at you and handed you her bread, and she wasn't afraid of you." She paused. "She's been afraid of every other man who's come to this house since Thomas died." He was quiet. "I'm not saying she knew who you were," Margaret said. "I'm saying she knew what you were." She looked at the stars. "The rest of it, the money, the land, that doesn't change what you did this week. It doesn't change the fence or the cattle or the roof or the barn tonight. She turned to look at him directly. But you should have told me. Yes, he said. I should have. No excuse, no elaboration, just yes. Which was, she thought, either the response of a man who genuinely understood what he'd done wrong, or a man who was very good at managing how he appeared, and she wasn't entirely sure yet which one it was, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that. Why now? She said. Why tell me tonight? He looked at her. The starlight made it hard to read his face exactly, but she thought she saw something in it that she recognized from the night she'd said she didn't know what to do. That quality of someone setting down something they'd been carrying at an angle that was becoming unsustainable. Because tomorrow is going to be different, he said, and you need to know who you're standing next to. She sat with that for a moment. What happens tomorrow? She said. Perch, he said. I received a message through Cole this afternoon while you were with the neighbors. Perch is sending a deputy commissioner and 2 federal marshals. They'll be here by morning. He looked at the road. They're not coming for Hale's papers on your ranch specifically. They're coming because they have enough from what I sent them, combined with what they already had, to start a federal inquiry into land fraud across the whole territory. She stared at him. When were you going to tell me this? She said. Before the window broke, he said, with a slight tiredness in his voice that was almost dry humor. She looked at him. Federal marshals. 2 of them, and a deputy commissioner who has the authority to freeze Hale's property transactions pending inquiry. He paused. Hale doesn't know any of this. He thinks he's dealing with a widow and her neighbors and an inconvenient drifter. She thought about Victor Hale on his horse in her yard that afternoon. The careful composure, the threat disguised as patience. He's going to fight it, she said. He'll try, Elias said. He has resources, he has lawyers. It won't be fast or clean. He looked at her steadily. But it will be real. And once a federal inquiry starts, the county judge loses jurisdiction over anything related to it. The forged deed on your property, the fraudulent debt, all of it goes to the federal level. She sat there and absorbed this. Outside of her knowledge, outside of anything she'd been able to plan or work toward in the week since Hale dropped a paper on her kitchen table, something had been in motion. Something that had started before Elias ever appeared on her porch. Started with a letter from a man on a good horse in a bad coat who'd looked at the shape of what was happening to people in this valley and decided to do something about it. She didn't know how to feel about that entirely. I'm glad it's happening, she said carefully. I want to be clear that I'm glad. Victor Hale has hurt a lot of people and I want it to stop. She paused. And I'm angry that you let me spend a week thinking I was fighting this alone when you already had reinforcements coming. You weren't fighting it alone, he said. I was here. I didn't know what you were. No, he said. I know. They sat in silence for a moment. Are you angry? He said. Not defensively, asking because he wanted to know. She thought about it honestly. Some, she said. Not as much as maybe I should be, which probably says something unflattering about my judgment. Or something accurate about your priorities, he said. She looked at him sideways. You assessed the week, he said. Not the biography. The week was what it was, regardless of who I am. That's a very convenient argument for the person who withheld the biography, she said. He nodded. It is, he said. I know. She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but it was close. The almost laugh of a person who is still inside the difficulty of something, but can see from where they're standing that eventually they'll be past it. Go inside, she said. It's cold. They went inside. She made coffee because her hands needed something to do, and he sat at the table and didn't offer to help, which was correct. She needed the occupied hands. She put the cup in front of him and sat down, and they drank coffee in the dark kitchen at whatever hour it was. Past midnight, she thought, maybe past 1. And after a while, the silence between them became the regular kind, the kind that didn't require anything from either of them. She slept in the house that night. Elias by the fire, she in her room, the girls at the Healy place. The house was quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not empty, just waiting. She lay in the dark and thought about federal marshals and 8,000 acres and a man who had walked 3 miles on foot to knock on her door, and about what all of it meant and what none of it changed and what some of it might become. And eventually she slept. In the morning, she went to get the girls before sunrise. Nora came home half asleep and let herself be carried the last 100 yards, which Margaret did without complaint, the solid weight of the child against her shoulder, the most straightforwardly good thing she'd felt in days. Ruth walked beside her, quiet and observant as always. Clara walked slightly ahead, the way Clara always walked, as though she was already at the destination and waiting for the rest of them to arrive. The marshals came at 9. There were 2 of them, and they were not what she'd expected in the sense that she'd built up some image in her mind of large formal men with badges you could see from across the yard, and what arrived was 2 men of ordinary size in ordinary coats, who looked at the property with professional attention and shook her hand with the matter-of-fact cordiality of people for whom this was Wednesday. The deputy commissioner, a man named Harlan Morse, was older, 60 or so, with the kind of face that had processed a great deal of information over a long career and had learned not to let much of it show. He had a case under his arm and a handshake that was brief and dry. He looked at Elias and said, "You look worse than I expected." Elias said, "It was a long week." "You could have told me you were going in without your regular outfit." "I told you I was going to assess the situation." "You told me you were going to look around," Morse said. "I pictured something less dramatic." He said it with the exasperation of someone who had been here before, and Margaret looked between the 2 of them and began to understand that Elias and Harlan Morse had a history that went back further than this particular situation, a history in which Elias had apparently done something like this before. She filed that away. Morse sat at her kitchen table. She gave him coffee. He put the case on the table and opened it and spread papers with the systematic deliberateness of a man who had done this many times and had no need to make it look impressive. He asked her questions for 2 hours. They were thorough questions, the kind that went sideways before they went forward, coming at the same piece of information from 3 different directions to see if the information held its shape. She answered every one of them directly and accurately, including the parts where she didn't know things, because Morse was the kind of man who would notice embellishment and would trust her more for not attempting it. At the end of 2 hours, he sat back and looked at the spread of papers on the table. "The deed is solid," he said. "The date gap you identified is exactly the kind of thing we've been seeing across Hale's other operations. He uses a gap, usually 18 months to 3 years, between clear title and claimed debt, because it's far enough back that records are harder to verify and memories are uncertain." He tapped a folder. "In this case, he miscalculated. You kept everything." "Thomas kept everything," she said. "I kept Thomas's system." Morse looked at her. "Your husband built a good system," he said. "It was simple, and he meant it." "He did," she said. The marshals had gone to find Cord Plimmer, not to arrest him yet. Morse explained this carefully, the specific sequence that federal procedure required, but to inform him that his employer was under federal inquiry and that any additional action against the Whitlock property or any other property in the valley would be considered obstruction. He wanted the message delivered face to face. Margaret asked what happened if Plimmer didn't receive the message well. Morse looked at her over his coffee cup. "Then we have a different conversation," he said. Elias, who had been sitting at the far end of the table through most of this, watching and occasionally answering Morse's specific questions about what he'd observed during the week, said, "Plimmer is careful. He won't escalate in front of federal authority." "You'd know," Morse said, with the slightly dry quality that seemed to be his normal register. "I'd know," Elias agreed. That afternoon, August Cole arrived with the Farnsworths and 2 other families who had received word through the chain that had started with Tom Healy the previous morning. They came with papers. Every family that was left in the valley that Hale had pressured came with whatever they had: deeds, letters, account records, a canceled promissory note that had Hale's name on it in a context that was going to require significant explaining. The Farnsworths had kept a journal. Mrs. Farnsworth had written down dates and names and specific conversations going back 2 years, which was not evidence in a formal legal sense, but was the kind of detailed corroboration that made formal evidence cohere. Morse went through everything. Webb came last. He came alone, without his hat this time, and he asked to speak to Morse privately, and they spoke for 45 minutes in the corner of the kitchen while Margaret kept the others occupied and didn't listen, which cost her some effort. When Webb came out, his face looked like a man who had set something down that he'd been carrying badly for a long time. He found Margaret in the yard. "I testified," he said. Unnecessary information, since she'd known that was what he was doing, But sometimes people needed to say a thing out loud to make it real for themselves. I know, she said. He's going to come after the store, Webb said. If this goes the way it looks like it's going, Hale is going to find a way to come after the store. Maybe, she said, or maybe the inquiry freezes enough of his operations that he's too busy to. She paused. And maybe you're not alone this time. He looked at her. There are 9 families in this valley who know each other now, she said. You saw it yesterday. That's not nothing, Garrett. He pressed his lips together. His eyes were doing something complicated. No, he said finally. It's not nothing. He left. She watched him ride down the road and thought about what it cost a person to stand up after they'd spent 2 years deciding it was impossible, and about how that cost was real and didn't disappear just because they'd done it, and how the right response to it was not congratulation, but something quieter and more durable. The marshals came back at mid-afternoon. They had found Plimmer. He had received the message. He had been, according to the marshal who reported this to Morse, extremely quiet about receiving it, which the marshal seemed to consider a good sign. He's going straight to Hale, Elias said. Yes, said the marshal. Then we have a few hours at most, Elias said, before Hale decides what his move is. Morse nodded. We'll be at the hotel in town tonight, formally and visibly. He looked at Elias. You understand what that means for Hale's options. It narrows them, Elias said, considerably. Morse began gathering his papers back into the case with the same systematic care he'd used spreading them out. Mrs. Whitlock, he said without looking up, I want you to understand something about what comes next. This inquiry will take time, months, possibly longer. The legal process for land fraud at this level is not quick and it is not clean, and there will be days when it looks like Hale is going to find a way through it. He closed the case. Then he looked at her. But the deed question, your specific deed, your specific property, that I can resolve within 30 days. The fraudulent debt claim fails completely under federal review. You will have written confirmation of that within the month. She sat with this. 30 days, she said. At most, he said. Probably less. She nodded once. She didn't cry. She'd decided a long time ago that she was a person who didn't cry when she got good news. Only when she was alone and the children couldn't see her, and the thing that she'd been braced for finally released itself. She would do that later. For now she nodded and thanked him and meant both things. Morse left with the marshals. The yard emptied out through the afternoon, families heading back to their own properties with the slightly dazed quality of people who had just watched the world restructure itself and hadn't finished deciding what to do with the new arrangement. The evening came down cold and clear, same as the night before. Margaret made supper with what she had, which wasn't much but was more than last week's final loaf, because Edna Healy had sent some things home with the girls that morning in the quiet way that neighbors help when they decide to stop waiting to be asked. Nora ate everything on her plate and then asked if there was more, which there wasn't, but the question itself was an improvement over the silence of a week ago. Ruth looked at Elias during supper. She'd been doing this more since last night, with a quality that had shifted, less measuring, more something she didn't have a word for yet. Are you staying? Ruth asked him. Clara's hand stilled on her fork. Margaret looked at her plate. Elias looked at Ruth. I don't have to leave tomorrow, he said, which was an answer, but not the answer Ruth had asked for, and Ruth was too sharp not to notice. But eventually, Ruth said. Ruth, Margaret said. It's a reasonable question, Ruth said. She said this without argument, just as a statement. He has a ranch, he has people working for him, he came here to do something, and he's done most of it, so eventually he'll leave. She looked at Elias. Right? Elias held Ruth's gaze. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the particular care of someone who understood they were being accurately assessed. I don't know yet, he said. Ruth looked at him for another moment. Then she went back to her food. She had gotten something from the answer, though Margaret couldn't have said what. Clara said nothing. She reached for her water cup and drank and set it down, and the moment passed. After supper, after the dishes, after the girls were in bed, Margaret stood at the window that Elias had boarded up the night before, the window where the lamp used to sit. The board was rough and functional, and not pretty, and it let in cold at the edges, but it was there, and the window behind it was intact. She heard Elias behind her. The board needs to be properly framed tomorrow, he said. I know, she said. I can do it before... He stopped. Before you go? She said. He was quiet. She turned from the window. Hale was standing near the table, not sitting, his coat on the hook by the door, his hat on the coat, the way they'd arranged themselves over the course of a week without discussing where things went. He looked at her with the same steadiness she'd come to rely on, the same unperformed quality that had made her stop trying to predict him and start simply watching. Iron Ridge is 140 miles, she said. Yes, he said. You have 34 people depending on you there. Yes, and 8,000 acres that need tending in the spring. Yes, he said, patient, waiting for where she was going. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She was figuring it out as she moved, the way she'd figured out most of the important things in her life, through motion rather than planning. When you came here, she said, before you knocked on my door, standing at that camp 3 miles north, deciding to walk in without your horse and your coat. She looked at him. What were you actually hoping to find? He thought about this. She could see him thinking about it, not deflecting, actually looking for the honest answer. I wasn't sure, he said. I'd heard about the valley from some of my men, from people who'd come through. I knew Hale's name from the North Country. I knew what he did. He paused. I think I wanted to see if anyone was still standing. And I found one person who was, he said. One household that hadn't given up or packed up or gone quiet. He looked at the table. I found you. She looked at him. The bread, he said. I want you to understand something about that. I've eaten at tables where everything was formal and correct, and where I sat at the head of the table because it was expected. I've had meals that cost more than most people make in a month. He looked up. That plate your daughter handed me was the first thing in a long time that felt like something real. I don't know how else to say it. She stood very still. I know what that sounds like, he said. It sounds like a thing a person says. It does, she said. I know. He looked at her steadily. I can only tell you it's true. She thought about Nora's bread in his hands, the way he'd taken it, the way something had moved across his face that she'd recognized later as something underneath gratitude. She thought about a week of watching a man work without being watched. The hinge, the roof, the bucket of water in the pre-dawn dark. Before a fire he shouldn't have known was coming. She thought about standing on a porch in front of 7 armed men and feeling, for the first time in 3 years, that she was not standing alone. I have 3 daughters, she said, and a ranch that still needs most of its fence repaired and a foundation with a drainage problem and a window that needs proper framing. I know, he said. And I don't know you, she said. Not really. I know the week I've known you. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It's not. And 140 miles is a long way. It is, he said. It's also not impassable. She looked at him. I'm not suggesting anything that would... He stopped. He looked slightly awkward for the first time she could remember, the awkwardness of a man who was competent in most situations and had just walked into one where competence wasn't the relevant skill. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I've tried to be clear about what I know and what I don't. What I know is that this week, this specific week, has been more important to me than anything I've done in a long time. And I know I don't want to ride away from here and act like that's not true. She was quiet for a moment. Ruth asked you if you were staying, she said. She did. And you said you don't know yet. I don't, he said. I know what I want. I don't know what you want. Those are different pieces of information. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He didn't move toward her or press the moment. He stood exactly where he was and let her look. The window needs proper framing, she said finally. He said nothing. And the East Foundation. You said you'd look at it more before you said anything definite. I did say that, he said. So you can't leave until you've looked at it properly, she said. That would be leaving work undone. The thing that was not quite a smile and was not quite pain moved across his face, but this time it was more smile than anything else. That would be leaving work undone, he said. So, she said. So, he said. She turned back to the boarded window. Outside, the night was clear and cold and the stars were back. Same stars as last night, same distance. Go to sleep, she said. The marshals are going to bring Hale in tomorrow, and there's going to be a lot of talking. Probably, he said. She went to her room. She lay in the dark for a long time. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Thomas deliberately because she had learned that the only way to do anything new was to let herself think about him directly first, to not approach it sideways. She thought about his face and the way he'd walked and the specific quality of his laugh, which had been sudden and full and slightly too loud for polite company, which she had loved. She thought about what he would have made of the week, of Elias, of the marshals on her kitchen table. She thought he probably would have liked the man on her kitchen floor. Thomas had been a practical person who respected competence and didn't have patience for performance, and she thought those qualities would have been visible to him within about 10 minutes. She didn't know if that meant anything or what it meant if it did. She just knew she thought it, and she let herself think it, and then she closed her eyes. In this morning, everything was different. She heard the horses before she was fully awake. Not the sound of riders arriving, but a different sound. The sound of a great many horses. And she was up and at the window before she'd decided to be. Through the frost on the glass, she could see the road. And on the road, in the gray dawn, was something she had not expected. Riders. Dozens of them. Coming from the north. She pressed her face closer to the glass and tried to count. She lost count at 30. They were riding in loose formation, not aggressive, not the compressed, purposeful movement of men coming to cause trouble, but the relaxed spread of riders who were not hurrying because they didn't need to. At the front of them, on a horse that was significantly better than the one Margaret had seen him on last week, rode Elias Boone. Not the Elias of the kitchen floor and the split boot and the coat that owed nobody anything. He was on a good horse. He was wearing his own coat, dark and well-fitted. He sat the horse the way she'd suspected he sat a horse ever since she'd watched him lead a stubborn cow down a ridge with a loop of rope and no visible effort. He rode into her yard and stopped, and around him, in a semicircle that widened as more riders came through the gate, 30-some men pulled up their horses and sat there in the morning light with the easy, settled patience of people who went where he went and had been doing it for a while. Margaret stood on her porch. She'd come out without her coat. She noticed this and didn't go back for it. Elias looked at her from the saddle. "I sent for them 2 days ago," he said, "before the fire, when I understood what Hale was likely to do next." He paused. "I should have told you I was sending for them." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I know," he said. "You keep having things to apologize for," she said. "I'm aware," he said. She looked at the riders behind him. 34 men, she'd been told, give or take. She looked at their faces, the varied, weathered faces of men who worked outside, who had their own histories and their own competencies, and who were sitting their horses quietly in a stranger's yard at dawn because the man in front of them had asked them to be here. She looked at Elias. "Iron Ridge Ranch," she said. "Iron Ridge Ranch," he said. Clara appeared in the doorway behind her. She looked at the riders, and then at Elias on the good horse, and then at her mother. "Huh," Clara said, which was, as always, high praise. And from the road, carrying across the still cold morning, came the sound of another group of horses. Not from the north this time, but from the direction of town, and Margaret looked and saw the marshals, and with them, between them, in a posture that had lost all of its deliberate relaxation and careful pleasantness, Victor Hale. He was not under arrest yet. That would come after, through the process that Morse had explained. But he was with the marshals in a way that made the distinction mostly academic, and his face had the look of a man who had turned a corner expecting one thing and found a yard full of Iron Ridge riders and understood, in the specific way that men like him understood things, that the arithmetic had changed entirely and he had not been the one to change it. He looked at Elias. Elias looked back. Neither of them said anything. The morning held everything in it for one still moment, the riders and the marshals and the frost and the smoke still faint from the barn, and 3 girls now visible in the doorway behind Margaret, Nora pressing between Clara and the frame to see, Ruth standing with her measuring gaze, Clara with her arms folded and her chin up. Then Morse spoke, and the moment released itself into motion, into the slow machinery of accountability arriving after a long delay, and Margaret stood on her porch in the cold without her coat, and watched it begin. Victor Hale did not go quietly. That was the first thing Margaret learned about what justice actually looked like when it arrived, which was that it looked nothing like the version in her head. In her head it had been clean, the marshals, the papers, the moment in the yard, and then something resolving the way a knot resolves when you find the right loop to pull. What it actually looked like was weeks of legal procedure conducted mostly in a building she never entered, driven by documents she never fully read, argued over by men she'd never met in a city 150 miles away. Hale had lawyers, good ones. He spent the first 2 weeks after that morning in her yard filing counter motions, disputing jurisdiction, claiming the federal inquiry was overreach, questioning the chain of evidence. His lawyers were expensive and precise, and they found 3 procedural gaps in Morse's initial filing that caused a delay of 11 days while Morse's office responded. The county judge, whose relationship with Hale was apparently more complicated than simply being in his pocket, recused himself from anything related to the inquiry, which was the right decision legally and the coward's version of accountability, and everyone in Ash Hollow understood that. Plimmer disappeared. Nobody knew where he went and nobody looked very hard, which Margaret thought said something about how much of Hale's operation had depended on Plimmer being the one who actually did things, while Hale maintained the distance of apparent respectability. Without Plimmer, Hale's other men became very cooperative with federal investigators in the specific way that men become cooperative when the person who knew where the bodies were buried has left the territory. The Henderson farm came back into contention during the second week. Old Henderson, notified by Cole through a chain of letters that had crossed 3 states, came back from Nebraska with his daughter and her husband, and a box of documents he'd kept because he hadn't known what else to do with them. He was 71 years old, and he walked into Morse's office in Cheyenne with that box under his arm, and he sat down and answered every question for 4 hours. And he came out looking like a man who had just set down a debt he'd been carrying for 2 years without realizing it was possible to put it down. Margaret heard about this from Cole, who heard it from Morse's deputy, and when she heard it, she sat at her kitchen table for a few minutes doing nothing, just sitting, thinking about an old man on a train from Nebraska with a box of papers, deciding at 71 that it wasn't too late. Elias stayed. He had sent most of his men back to Iron Ridge after 2 days, keeping 4 of them to help with the barn repairs and the fence work and the drainage problem under the East Foundation, which turned out to be more complicated than he'd initially thought, and required redirecting a drainage channel that had been sitting wrong for years. The 4 men worked without comment or complaint and did what Elias asked and treated Margaret with the matter-of-fact respect of people who understood what the situation was without needing anyone to explain it to them. She watched how they were with him. That was instructive. Men who worked for someone told you more about that person than anything the person said about themselves. And what she saw was men who did what he asked, because they respected his judgment, not because they were afraid of what happened if they didn't. There was a difference, and it was visible if you looked. He fixed the window frame himself. She watched him do it on the 3rd morning after the fire, working with the careful attention he brought to everything, and when it was done it was better than the original, which she didn't say out loud because there was no need to say it. The East Foundation took 4 days. He came in on the 4th evening with dirt on his boots and his hands, and a line between his brows that was the thinking expression she knew by now, and he sat down at the table and said, "It's done. It's not going to be a problem now. But you need to watch the northwest corner in the spring thaw. There's still a weak point there." "I'll watch it," she said. "I'll check it," he said. She looked at him. "When I come back," he said. She turned back to the stove. "When you come back," she said, and left it there, which was where it needed to sit for now. He left on a Thursday in early February. His men had gone the day before. He stood in the yard with his horse, the good horse, the Iron Ridge horse, which had been stabled in her barn for 2 weeks and had eaten her hay without apology. And he looked at the house and then at her. The girls were inside. She'd told them to stay in, partly because the cold was serious, and partly because she wanted this to be something that happened between adults without an audience. "Morse says 30 days, he said. "I think it'll be less." "I know," she said. "Cole knows how to reach me if anything." "I know," she said again. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him deciding something, the small, visible calculation she'd come to recognize. He reached into his coat and took out a folded paper and held it out to her. She took it. It was heavy paper, good quality, with writing on it she didn't read yet. "That's the Iron Ridge address," he said. "And the name of my foreman. If I'm not there when you send a letter, he'll know where to reach me." She held the paper. "You expect me to write to you?" "I'm hoping you might," he said. She looked at the paper. Then she looked at him. You're still bad at saying things directly, she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile and not quite embarrassment, the cousin of both. I'm working on it, he said. She put the paper in her pocket. He mounted up. He looked down at her from the saddle with an expression she was going to think about for a long time, something that had in it all of the week, and the fire, and the yard full of riders, and the coffee at midnight, and the things said and not said, all of it compressed into the specific way a person looks at you when they're about to leave and have not resolved whether leaving is the right thing and are doing it anyway because some things need time and distance to become clear. Margaret, he said. Elias, she said. He turned the horse and rode out of the yard. She stood there until he was gone, and then she stood there a little longer, and then she went inside. Nora was at the window. He's coming back, Nora said. It was not a question. He said he would, Margaret said. Good, Nora said, and went back to what she'd been doing, which was drawing something on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal, the specific focused absorption of a 6-year-old who had already processed the situation to her satisfaction. Ruth said nothing. She was reading, or had been reading, and she looked at her mother once when Margaret came in and then back at her book, which meant she'd heard the horse leave and was filing things away in the careful interior archive she maintained. Clara was doing accounts at the table. She'd taken over the household accounts 3 weeks ago in the way Clara took over things she identified as needing doing, without asking, without announcing, simply doing. She was 11, and she was better at it than some adults Margaret had known. She didn't look up from the accounts when Margaret came in, but she said, "The lumber from the barn repair. Elias left it. There's enough to fix the east fence section that's still down." "I know," Margaret said. "His men left the tools too," Clara said. "The good ones." Margaret stood at the window where the new frame was fitted clean and tight, no draft coming through at the edges anymore. Outside, the road was empty. "I know," she said again. 17 days later, not 30, the letter came from Morse's office. It arrived with the mail on a Tuesday, a thick envelope with the territorial seal on it, and Margaret opened it at the table with the girls at school and the house quiet around her. She read it twice before she fully understood it, and then she read the specific paragraph a third time. Clear title confirmed. Fraudulent debt claim dismissed under federal review. The Whitlock homestead, as filed and recorded in 1871, remained free of encumbrance. Any legal action to the contrary was hereby null and void under the authority of the Territorial Commissioner's office. She put the letter down. She looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the ring left by 10,000 cups of coffee, at the place where Nora sat, and the place where Ruth sat, and the place where Clara sat, and the place where Elias had sat for 2 weeks, and where the wood showed no mark of him because wood doesn't mark that easily. You had to sit somewhere for years before the wood remembered you. She picked up the letter and put it in the box where she kept the deed. Then she wrote a letter. 2 pages, which was longer than she'd intended, and she rewrote the first paragraph 4 times before she decided it was probably accurate. She told him about the commissioner's letter. She told him about the east fence section and the lumber. She told him Nora had started calling the pig something new, but refused to explain why. She told him Ruth had asked her 2 days ago whether Iron Ridge had a school nearby, which she was fairly sure was not a question about Ruth's interest in schools generally. She almost didn't include the last part. She read it twice and left it in because it was true, and she'd decided to be honest. She sealed it and gave it to Tom Healy to take to the post the next morning, and then she went to fix the east fence section herself because it needed doing, and she wasn't going to wait for someone else to do it. The winter finished slowly, the way Wyoming winters finished, grudgingly, giving back the ground a few degrees at a time before taking 2 of them back again, until sometime in late March, the decision seemed to have been made and the snow began to mean it. The mud came first, which was always the unglamorous part of spring, everything soft and treacherous and brown. And then gradually the green started, first tentative and then committed, the way the land recovered from the cold, not all at once, but certainly. Hale's case moved through the federal system. Margaret followed it through Morse's periodic letters and through Cole, who had become something unexpected over the winter. Not a friend exactly, but an ally in the specific committed way of people who have stood in the same yard together on a difficult day. Cole came by every 2 weeks or so, and they drank coffee and talked about what they were hearing, and what they were hearing was that the case was building, slowly and badly for Hale, the layers of fraud coming apart as the investigators pulled at them. 3 more families came forward in February. 2 in March. The Henderson farm was formally restored in March as well. The legal transfer reversed under the inquiry's authority, which meant old Henderson could come home if he wanted to. Margaret heard he was planning to come back in April. Cord Plimmer was found in Utah in the first week of March and extradited back to the territory. He came back cooperative in the complete way of a man who had spent several weeks thinking about what cooperative looked like versus what uncooperative looked like, and had made a practical decision. He gave testimony that went on for 2 days and corroborated most of what the documentation already showed and added detail to the parts it didn't. Webb told her about it in his store, which she visited more often now, partly because she needed things from it, and partly because the store had become a place where the Valley's information collected, and she'd stopped pretending she didn't want access to that information. Plimmer named names, Webb said, including the county judge. She'd suspected. And the judge? Resigned last week, Webb said, quietly, before anyone had to ask him to. She bought her flour and her salt, and she rode home in the March mud and thought about a man who had resigned quietly before anyone asked him to, which was the specific cowardice of people who wanted the benefits of corruption without the public accounting of it. And she thought about how that was its own kind of consequence, even if it wasn't the one you'd have chosen. Elias's first letter came in mid-February. It was 1 page. It told her the East Pasture had flooded slightly in a January thaw, which was a known problem they'd been trying to address for 2 years, and that his foreman had handled it well. It said Iron Ridge had had a good calf season, 32 new head. It said the school 2 miles from the ranch had a teacher who had been there for 6 years and was, by general agreement in the area, very good. That last sentence sat on the page doing nothing except being there, and she read it the same way Ruth had asked about schools, which was understanding what was being said without anyone having to say it. She wrote back. He wrote back. The letters became a rhythm, not quite weekly, close to it, and they were not love letters in any conventional sense. They were letters between 2 people who had established that there was something worth finding out, and were finding it out in the only way available to them across 140 miles of Wyoming. She told him things she hadn't expected to tell anyone. About Thomas. Not just what he'd been like, but what it had cost her. What the 3 years alone had done to the way she moved through the world. The hypervigilance, the way she woke at every sound. The specific exhaustion of being the only person responsible for everything. She told him about the barn at night and what it had felt like to put out that fire with him. The quality of working alongside someone again after so long. He told her things too. He told her about his father, who had built Iron Ridge from nothing and had not been a warm man but had been a capable one, and about the specific loneliness of inheriting something large, of being responsible for land and people when you were 26 and hadn't entirely finished figuring out who you were. He told her about the years of building, the years of making decisions that didn't always come out right, the decisions he'd gotten wrong and what they'd cost and who they'd cost. I was not flattering about himself in these letters, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated the other kind. He came back in April. She heard the horse before she saw him, which had become her way of knowing things. Sound first, then sight. And she was on the porch when he came through the gate. He looked the same and he looked different, or she looked at him differently, which was probably the more accurate version. He was on the good horse again. He had a coat that was neither the good coat nor the traded coat, but something in between, practical and worn in. And she thought that was probably the closest thing to the truth of him, somewhere between the best version and the worst, occupied in the middle like most people. He dismounted and stood in the yard. "The east fence," he said. "Fixed," she said. "I saw." He'd ridden past it. "Nicely done." "I've been doing fences for 11 years," she said. "I know," he said. They looked at each other across the yard. "Nora named the pig Gerald," she said. "We still don't know why." Something moved across his face that was actually a smile this time, not the cousin of one. "Gerald is a fine name for a pig," he said. "That's more or less what Nora said." He took a breath. She could see him doing it, the deliberate kind, the kind that preceded something. "I have a proposition," he said. "A practical one. I want to say that first because I don't want you to think—" He stopped. Started again. "There's a house on the north section of Iron Ridge that's been empty for 3 years. It was the foreman's house when we had 2 foremen, which we don't anymore. It's a real house. 3 bedrooms, good roof, better kitchen than... He looked at the house behind her and stopped himself from finishing that sentence, which she appreciated. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm not trying to move fast. I just thought if... He stopped again. He was bad at this. She told him he was bad at saying things directly, and he apparently was also bad at this, which was the specific failure of a competent man operating in a domain where competence wasn't the relevant skill, and he knew it, and it was making him careful in a way that came out as fractured. She came down the porch steps. She walked across the yard to where he was standing, and she looked up at him and she said, "Ask me the actual question, Elias." He looked at her. "I want you to come to Iron Ridge," he said, "you and the girls. I want you to see it, and I want to see if what I think is true, and I can't find that out from 140 miles away." He held her gaze. That's the actual question. She considered it. She thought about what it meant to say yes and what it meant to say not yet and what it meant to say no. And she thought about which of those was honest and which of those was fear dressed up as caution, and she had learned over 3 years alone to be suspicious of caution that served her ego more than her actual life. "The girls would need to see it too," she said. "I know," he said. "Clara is going to ask hard questions." "I expect that," he said. "Ruth is going to watch everything and say almost nothing and then tell me what she thinks when we're alone." "Also expected," he said. "Nora is going to try to adopt whatever animals you have." "We have 47 horses and several hundred cattle," he said. "She's welcome to try." She looked at him. She thought about a woman who had stood in a kitchen with flour on her hands and heard a knock at the door on the worst night of her year and had opened it anyway. She thought about what that decision had set in motion, all of it, the week and the fire and the neighbors in the yard and the marshals and the deed with her name confirmed on it, all of it flowing from the fact that she had opened a door in the dark and said come in without knowing what she was letting in. She thought that was probably the thing you could say about most of the important decisions in a life. You didn't know what you were letting in. You made the best judgment you could with the information available, and you opened the door and you found out. "June," she said. He waited. "After the spring work is done and the girls are out of school," she said, "we'll come in June." Something in his face did what it had done on the very first night, when Nora held bread across the table toward a stranger. That thing that was not quite a smile and not quite pain, and was something underneath both of them. Except it had shifted now, or she could read it better now, and what she saw in it was something more like relief. The specific relief of a person who has been waiting for something without being entirely sure it was coming. "June," he said. "June," she said. She went back up the porch steps. "Coffee," she said, "and then you can look at the northwest corner of the east foundation, the one you said to watch in the spring thaw. Did it move? Come look," she said. He tied the horse and followed her inside. They got married the following October, which was nobody's plan, and also not a surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention. It happened the way things happened between people who had been through something real together, not as the resolution of a romantic story, but as the practical acknowledgement of something that had been true for a while and was now ready to be official. The girls were at Iron Ridge by then. They'd come in June, as Margaret had said, and the visit that was supposed to be 2 weeks became 3, and then the school year started and the girls were enrolled in the school 2 miles from the ranch, with the good teacher who had been there 6 years. And Margaret told herself she'd make a final decision later, and then stopped needing to make it. Clara took to ranch work with the same grim competence she brought to everything, and by September Elias's foreman had given her a specific section of fence to be responsible for, which was an unusual thing to give an 11-year-old girl, and Clara took it seriously in the way Clara took everything seriously, and the fence held. Ruth befriended the teacher at the school, a quiet young woman named Opal, who had come from Ohio and found herself in Wyoming and decided to stay because the landscape did something to her she couldn't explain to people back home. Ruth and Opal could often be found in the same corner of the schoolroom after classes, one of them reading and one of them grading papers, and neither of them requiring conversation, which was the specific friendship of people who understood each other's relationship to silence. Nora named 2 horses and a barn cat. The barn cat did not accept the name, but Nora continued to use it anyway, which was consistent with Nora's general approach to the world. The day Margaret and Elias married was cold and clear, a perfect October day in the way Wyoming sometimes produced them, like an apology for what winter was about to become. The ceremony was brief and practical, conducted by a justice of the peace in Ash Hollow, with Cole and his wife standing beside them, and the three girls in a row looking exactly as you'd expect three daughters to look at their mother's wedding. Clara with her chin up and her hands folded, Ruth watchful, Nora holding a wildflower she'd found somewhere that was technically past its season and should not have still been blooming. After the ceremony, Cole shook Elias's hand with the gruff warmth of a man who didn't do warmth easily and was making an exception. "Took you long enough," Cole said. "It took the time it took," Elias said. "She could have had any number of suitors in the valley by spring," Cole said. "I want you to know that." "I know," Elias said. "I'm just saying." "I understand what you're saying, August." Cole looked at him for a moment, then nodded once and let it go, which was Cole's version of a blessing. Margaret, standing nearby with Clara, heard all of this and said nothing. She thought Cole was probably exaggerating about the suitors, or maybe not. It hadn't particularly mattered either way. She'd not been looking for a suitor. She'd been looking for a way to keep her land and her family together through a January that wanted to take everything. And what she'd gotten was considerably more complicated and considerably better than what she'd been looking for, which was the way things went sometimes when you opened the door in the dark. Victor Hale's trial began that November in Cheyenne. It went on for 6 weeks. The verdict, when it came in the second week of December, was guilty on 14 counts of land fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy across 3 counties. He was sentenced to 8 years in the Territorial Penitentiary, which was not the longest sentence that had ever been given for what he'd done to people, but it was long enough that he'd be an old man when he came out, and the man he'd been would not survive the interim. The county judge who had resigned quietly was charged separately, in February of the following year, with a narrower set of counts that reflected what they could prove, rather than what they knew. He received 3 years probation and a permanent bar from public office, which was less than what the situation deserved and more than he'd believed was coming for him, and so it occupied the exact middle ground of justice, which is where justice usually lives. The Henderson farm was restored. Henderson came back in April and fixed the fence that nobody had tended and planted a late crop that wasn't a failure and wasn't a success, but was a crop, which he seemed to regard as adequate. He was 71 years old and home, and that was what mattered. Webb kept the store. He kept it for 12 more years, and in that time, he became the kind of person in Ash Hollow that people went to for information and perspective, not just goods. He never publicly talked about the role he'd played in the inquiry. He didn't have to. People knew. What Margaret thought about in the years that followed was not the trial or the verdict or any of the formal resolutions of formal things. What she thought about was smaller than that and more durable. She thought about a night in January when she had flour on her hands and a piece of paper on her table and 4 plates on the table with 4 pieces of bread, and how she had stood at her door in the dark and made a decision that she hadn't known she was making. She hadn't thought, this is the moment that changes everything. You don't think that. The moment that changes everything looks the same as every other moment from the outside. A knock, a cold night, a stranger in a bad coat with honest eyes and borrowed hunger. What she had thought was simply, it's 15 below and there's a person at my door. And she'd stepped back. And it turned out that sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the thing you do without calculation, without knowing what it leads to, without the comfort of understanding the full shape of the decision. Sometimes that's the thing that makes everything else possible. Not because the universe rewards kindness, which it doesn't do reliably, and not because the stranger always turns out to be someone significant, which would be a terrible way to make decisions, but because the kind of person you are in the small moments, in the dark moments, in the moments when nobody is watching and the cost is real and the outcome is uncertain. That's not separate from the life you're trying to build. It is the life. It's the thing your daughters learn from you without knowing they're learning it. Nora understood this the earliest, the way small children understand things before they have the words for them. She had held out her bread without hesitating, without calculating, without asking what she'd get in return. She had just looked at a person who was cold and hungry and had held out what she had. Clara understood it through its absence, through the years she'd spent being the careful one, the watchful one, the one who assessed before she committed, and through the slow recognition that caution without courage was just a sophisticated way of making nothing happen. Ruth understood it the way Ruth understood most things, through sustained and patient observation of everyone around her, and arrived at it in her own time in her own way, which was the only way Ruth ever arrived at anything. And Margaret understood it the way people understand things they've lived through rather than thought through, which is the kind of understanding that doesn't require explanation because it's built into the way you move and the choices you make and what you do when there's a knock at the door on a cold night and you don't know what's on the other side. You listen first, and then you open it.